I am Sloan, 33 years old, and my father just texted me that no one cares about my Navy career, warning me not to embarrass my sister's billionaire groom at their rehearsal dinner. Funny, because the second I took a sip of my cheap sparkling water, I knew tomorrow's wedding would end with 300 battle-hardened SEALs storming the country club and shattering their perfect illusion. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The private dining room of one of Manhattan's most exclusive Michelin star restaurants was suffocating. The air smelled of white truffle oil, expensive orchids, and forced laughter. I sat at the absolute farthest end of the long mahogany table, wearing a simple conservative navy dress that my mother Beatrice had already criticized 3 separate times since the appetizers were served. At the center of attention, basking in the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers, sat my sister Whitney. Tomorrow, she was marrying Donovan. Donovan was a highly successful African-American venture capitalist who had made his immense fortune securing lucrative and highly questionable defense contracts for the military. He was sharp, undeniably brilliant, but carried an arrogance that filled the room. My father, Winston, was holding court at the head of the table, swirling a glass of imported red wine that cost more than my first car. He was busy praising Donovan to the other elite guests, treating him like the golden son he always wanted, entirely ignoring the actual daughter sitting just a few feet away. I had been invisible to them since I was 18 years old. The day I walked away from Winston's corporate real estate empire to enlist in the United States Navy, I instantly became the family scapegoat. They viewed my military service not as a sacrifice for my country, but as a severe public relations embarrassment for an East Coast elite family. To them, I was just a grunt who lacked the sophistication to survive in their world of high finance and country clubs. The meal dragged on through 5 agonizing courses of backhanded compliments and passive-aggressive jabs. My family had a talent for smiling while sliding a knife between your ribs. I ate my sea bass in silence, observing the room with the situational awareness drilled into me over a decade of classified deployments. Finally, the waiters approached our end of the table to clear the dessert plates. The head maitre d' stepped forward carrying a polished silver tray, holding a sleek black leather folder. Instead of handing it to Winston or Donovan, who had ostensibly hosted this lavish rehearsal dinner to impress their wealthy investors, the maitre d' hesitated. At a sharp, almost imperceptible nod from my mother, he walked the length of the room and set the folder directly in front of me. I opened it and stared at the total. $15,000. It was a staggering sum for a single night of excess. I looked up to see my mother Beatrice watching me with a calculated, victorious smirk. She leaned across the table, her heavy diamond necklace catching the dim light, ensuring the guests seated nearby were listening. "You always say the military taught you the value of service, Sloan," she said, her voice carrying that syrupy sweetness she used right before a strike. "Serve your sister today and pay the bill. Consider it rent for all the years we put a roof over your head before you ran off to play soldier in the mud." I did not flinch. I had spent over a decade surviving grueling combat situations and impossible odds. Beatrice's petty cruelty was nothing new. I simply closed the leather folder and looked at her. But before I could speak, Whitney chimed in, swirling her vintage champagne with a dramatic sigh. "Mom is right," Sloan, Whitney said, adjusting her designer wrap. "You threw your life away for a poverty wage in the military, when you could have had a real, respectable career at Dad's firm. The absolute least you can do is contribute to my wedding weekend. You have been living off government handouts while Donovan and Dad actually work for a living. It is time you pulled your weight." I looked at Whitney taking in her custom silk dress and the massive flawless diamond sparkling on her finger. She had never worked a single day in her life, living entirely off Winston's trust funds, and now Donovan's venture capital. Then Donovan laughed. It was a rich, booming sound that immediately drew everyone's attention. He leaned back in his chair, shooting the cuffs of his custom-tailored suit to reveal a luxury watch worth a down payment on a mansion. "Come on," Donovan said, his tone dripping with absolute condescension. "Leave her alone." Donovan reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy platinum credit card. He tossed it onto the silver tray with a loud dismissive clatter. I got it, Wit. I do not want your sister pawning some cheap bronze medal just to pay for our caviar. She probably has not seen a bill this high in her entire life. Give the girl a break. The table erupted in polite, mocking laughter. My father chuckled loudly, raising his wineglass to Donovan in a silent toast of masculine solidarity. I looked at the platinum card sitting on top of the receipt. I looked at Donovan's smug face, entirely too proud of his ability to bail out his pathetic sister-in-law. Then I looked at my sister's triumphant smile and finally at my parents who stared at me with undisguised pity. They truly believed I was a failure. They believed I was just a low-ranking sailor scraping by on a government salary, living in barracks and taking orders. They had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last decade rising through the most elite ranks to become a commander in the Navy SEALs. They did not know about the covert operations, the hazard pay, or the massive trust my late grandfather had secretly left solely to me, which I had invested brilliantly. And they certainly did not know that just this week I had been officially appointed by the Pentagon as the Director of Department of Defense contract audits for the entire Eastern Seaboard. I calmly reached out and picked up Donovan's platinum card. I held it between two fingers, locking eyes with him across the long table. It is a nice gesture, Donovan. I said, my voice dangerously quiet, cutting through the fading laughter like a blade. But keep your money. You are going to need it very soon. I slid his card across the polished mahogany wood, sending it right back into his hand. Then I reached into my small, unassuming clutch. I did not pull out a standard bank debit card. I pulled out a solid black titanium Centurion card. It was the exclusive invitation-only card offered solely to individuals with extraordinary financial portfolios. I dropped it onto the silver tray. The heavy metal hit the leather with a solid, undeniable thud that echoed in the suddenly silent room. The mocking laughter died instantly. Winston's wineglass stopped swirling in his hand. Beatrice's smug smirk vanished entirely, replaced by a look of utter breathless confusion. Donovan stared at the black metallic card sitting on the tray, his eyes widening. His arrogant posture dissolved into rigid shock. Donovan operated in the highest tiers of finance. He knew exactly what that card meant. He knew the impossible level of wealth, liquid assets, and elite access required to even be considered for one. Whitney looked back and forth between the black card and Donovan's pale face, not fully grasping the financial implications, but clearly understanding that the entire power dynamic at the table had just violently shifted. No one spoke. No one breathed. The wealthy investors at the adjacent tables turned to stare. My family simply sat there paralyzed, looking at the metallic rectangle that completely shattered their deeply held narrative of my pathetic, poverty-stricken existence. Before Winston could recover enough to demand an explanation, and before Donovan could stammer out a question about how a supposedly broke military grunt possessed a card his own venture capital partners desperately coveted, a sharp vibration broke the suffocating silence. My highly encrypted burner phone resting next to my water glass lit up. I glanced down at the bright screen. The text message was brief, urgent, and highly classified. Pentagon code red target acquired. I picked up my phone and stood up from the table, smoothly straightening the skirt of my simple navy dress. I looked down at my stunned family, taking in their open mouths, their wide eyes, and their sudden terrifying realization that they did not know me at all. Enjoy the caviar, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion as I looked directly at my father. I have a mess to clean up. I turned and walked out of the Michelin star restaurant, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor, leaving my black card on the silver tray and my family drowning in absolute terrified silence. My name is Sloane. I am 33 years old, and last night I walked out of my sister's rehearsal dinner after dropping a solid black Centurion card on a $15,000 bill. My family stared in absolute shock, assuming I was running away in shame. They had no idea I was actually stepping out to answer a classified code red from the Pentagon. Now standing outside the VIP bridal suite on the crisp morning of the wedding, the simmering tension from last night felt like a lit fuse. I took a deep breath of the air, heavy with the scent of expensive floral arrangements, and pushed the heavy mahogany doors open. The room was a chaotic blur of makeup artists popping champagne corks and clouds of expensive hairspray. My sister Whitney sat in the center of it all, wrapped in a silk robe emblazoned with the word bride in gold lettering, sipping a mimosa. I walked straight toward the garment rack where the custom silk bridesmaid dresses hung in a neat row. I reached for the elegant emerald green gown with my name tag attached to the velvet hanger. Before my fingers could even brush the fabric, a hand clamped down on my wrist with startling force. My mother Beatrice snatched the silk gown away with a violent jerk. She stared at me, her manicured features twisted into a mask of pure disgust. Without a word, she reached behind the rack and threw a heavy plastic garment bag directly at my chest. "Put that on instead," Beatrice ordered, her voice cutting through the lively chatter of the room like the crack of a whip. I unzipped the bag. Inside hung a cheap, stiff, ash-gray dress that looked like it had been pulled from a discount rack a decade ago. It had long, restrictive sleeves and a high collar that zipped all the way up to the chin. It was a stark, humiliating contrast to the flowing, backless emerald gowns the other bridesmaids were currently slipping into. "You cannot wear a backless gown, Sloane," Beatrice hissed, stepping closer so the makeup artist would not hear her venom. "Your shoulders are covered in those disgusting, hideous scars. It looks like you were dragged through a meat grinder." Donovan's family is East Coast elite. They are refined, wealthy people. They will be absolutely nauseated looking at your mutilated skin during the ceremony. I looked down at the dull gray fabric in my hands. The scars she was referring to were a jagged raised network of thick tissue wrapping around my left shoulder and collarbone. They were the permanent physical receipt of a highly classified extraction in a hostile desert. They were the direct result of me throwing my own body over a live fragmentation grenade to shield 3 of my pinned-down unit members. My skin had been torn apart so that 3 fathers could go home to their children. To the United States military, those scars were the mark of a hero. I had bled for my country, but to my mother, they were nothing more than a cosmetic inconvenience that threatened to ruin her perfect family aesthetic. Whitney spun around in her plush makeup chair, setting her champagne flute on the vanity. "Listen to Mom Sloane," she said, rolling her eyes with a heavy sigh. "Donovan has high-profile investors flying in from all over the world today. Men who deal in billions, not the poverty wages you scrape together. I cannot have my wedding photos ruined because you want to show off your ugly war wounds. Just put the gray dress on and blend into the background. That is what you are best at anyway." I did not raise my voice. I did not attempt to justify my survival to women who considered a chipped nail to be a life-altering tragedy. I simply held the gray dress and met my mother's harsh glare with absolute, unwavering silence. Before I could formulate a response, the heavy door of the bridal suite slammed open. Winston marched in. My father wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than the annual salary of the soldiers I commanded. He was flanked by 2 nervous event coordinators holding clipboards, but he waved them away and stormed directly toward me, his face flushed with arrogant authority. He did not offer a morning greeting. He did not ask how I was doing. He shoved a crumpled piece of heavy cardstock directly against my chest. "Take a good look at that seating chart," Sloane Winston barked, pointing a thick finger at the paper. "You are not walking down the aisle with the rest of the bridal party. You are not standing at the altar, and you are certainly not sitting at the head table with the family. You are assigned to table 42. I glanced down at the chart. The country club ballroom was massive, designed to hold 500 of the city's most elite guests. The head table was prominently situated on a raised dais, surrounded by extravagant floral arches. Table 42, however, was a tiny circular table shoved into the darkest corner of the room, directly adjacent to the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. It was the table specifically reserved for the photographers on their meal break, the cleanup crew, and the relatives my family deemed too embarrassing to publicly acknowledge. "You will sit there quietly," Winston commanded, stepping into my personal space. "You will not mingle with Donovan's venture capital partners. You will not speak to my board of directors. And if anyone happens to wander back to that kitchen door and asks what you do for a living, you will tell them you handle administrative HR paperwork in a cubicle. I stared at him, my expression completely neutral. Administrative HR paperwork. Winston sneered, adjusting his expensive silk tie. Do not look at me like that. No one in this ballroom wants to hear about a woman doing grunt work in the mud. They do not want to hear about military deployments or whatever it is you do to scrape by on taxpayer dollars. Donovan is about to close a massive defense contract today, and he needs these investors completely focused on his financial brilliance, not distracted by your depressing life choices. You will keep your mouth shut, you will wear that gray dress, and you will stay entirely out of sight. I will not let your presence compromise this family's financial future. The air in the room grew heavy and suffocating. The makeup artists had stopped working, pretending to organize their brushes while actively listening to my father strip away my dignity piece by piece. Beatrice smiled, clearly thrilled that Winston had arrived to enforce her cruelty. Whitney simply turned back to her mirror, admiring her own reflection, entirely unbothered by the fact that her sister was being banished to the shadows on her wedding day. They expected me to break. They expected the tears, the apologies, the desperate pleas for acceptance that I used to offer when I was a naive 18-year-old girl begging for my parents' love. But that girl died a long time ago. She died in grueling combat training camps, she died in freezing ocean waters, and she was reborn, forged in absolute steel. I calmly folded the seating chart and slipped it into the pocket of the cheap gray dress. I did not cry. I did not shout. I looked Winston dead in the eye, my gaze carrying the freezing weight of a commanding officer who had stared down enemy combatants without ever blinking. Do not worry, Dad, I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly steady. I will not ruin your perfect illusion. Just pray it does not shatter on its own. Winston scoffed, completely missing the lethal promise hidden in my words. He turned on his heel and marched out of the room to inspect the floral arrangements, Beatrice hurrying closely behind him to ensure the country club staff was meeting her impossible standards. Whitney waved a dismissive hand at me in the mirror, signaling that my presence was no longer required in her VIP sanctuary. I walked into the adjoining private bathroom and slipped the gray dress over my head. The coarse, rigid fabric scratched against my scars, a physical reminder of the superficiality I was dealing with. I smoothed out the wrinkles, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The dress was purposely designed to make me look small, irrelevant, and weak. It was meant to completely erase me from their perfect narrative. I smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile. They had no idea that they had just given me the perfect camouflage. As I stepped out of the bathroom, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed on the suite door. The remaining bridesmaids ignored it, too busy gossiping over their mimosas. I walked over and opened the heavy door just a fraction. Standing in the hallway was a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a sharp charcoal suit. To anyone else, he looked like standard private event security. To me, his perfect posture, his high and tight haircut, and the absolute stillness of his hands immediately identified him as an undercover operative from my intelligence unit. He stepped forward, blocking the view from the hallway, and smoothly handed me a sleek, matte black briefcase. The handle featured a highly classified biometric retinal scanner. I took the briefcase, the heavy weight of the federal documents inside, grounding me instantly. The operative leaned in close, his eyes darting quickly down the hallway to ensure the perimeter was clear. He locked eyes with me, his expression turning to unyielding stone. "Commander," he whispered, his voice barely carrying over the sound of the wedding preparations behind me. "Admiral Thorne is wheels up. 15 minutes. I gripped the handle of the briefcase, my thumb resting just millimeters away from the biometric lock. I nodded once. The countdown to their destruction had officially begun. The grand ballroom of the elite country club was a masterclass in aggressive, suffocating wealth. Thousands of rare white orchids cascaded from the vaulted ceilings imported specifically for this single evening. A 10-piece string quartet played elegantly from a raised balcony, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. I walked into the cavernous space wearing the stiff, high-collared gray dress, clutching the matte black briefcase tightly in my hand. I bypassed the glowing center of the room and immediately navigated toward the shadows. My father had not been exaggerating about my seating assignment. Table 42 was practically inside the service corridor. While the head table sat on a literal raised platform bathed in warm golden light, my table wobbled on uneven floorboards every time a waiter pushed forcefully through the swinging metal kitchen doors. I sat down, placing the heavy biometric briefcase carefully by my feet. My dining companions consisted of a tired catering manager taking a forced 10-minute break, a distant great aunt who had been entirely cut out of the family trust years ago, and two bewildered teenage cousins who spent the entire time staring at their phones. It was the absolute fringe of the celebration, the designated dumping ground for anyone who did not fit my parents' pristine, highly curated narrative of success. Winston and Beatrice were busy working the room, floating from table to table with broad, practiced smiles. When they passed near my corner, they looked straight through me, as if I were nothing more than a ghost haunting their perfect day. At one point, Beatrice physically steered a group of Donovan's wealthy venture capital partners away from my table, laughing loudly about how the venue staff needed to be kept out of sight to preserve the aesthetic. She did not even lower her voice. She wanted me to hear it. She wanted me to feel small. I watched them all with the detached, calculated precision of a sniper surveying an open target. They truly thought isolating me was a harsh punishment. They believed that putting me in the cheap gray dress and hiding me by the kitchen exits would break my spirit. They did not realize they had actually given me the perfect tactical vantage point. From table 42, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the entire ballroom, all the exit routes, and the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the pristine golf course outside. An hour into the reception, the clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal glass signaled the start of the toasts. The string quartet faded out. The room fell into an expectant, hushed silence. Whitney stood up from the center of the head table, adjusting the sparkling bodice of her custom designer gown. She beamed at Donovan, looking like the picture-perfect bride before casting a deliberate, sweeping glance toward the very back of the room where she knew I was sitting. "I am so incredibly blessed to marry a man with actual drive and ambition," Whitney announced, her voice echoing perfectly through the state-of-the-art sound system. "In this family, we value real success. We value people who build empires. We do not run away from adult responsibility to hide in government handouts. We do not pretend that taking orders in the mud for a poverty wage makes you a hero. We build legacies that actually matter." The crowd offered polite, approving applause. Beatrice wiped a theatrical, perfectly rehearsed tear from her eye. Winston nodded firmly, his chest puffed out with intense pride. Whitney had managed to insult my entire life of service disguised as a romantic tribute to her new husband. The sheer audacity of her entitlement was staggering, but I remained perfectly still. I did not shift in my seat. I did not lower my gaze. Donovan took the microphone next. His face was flushed with expensive whiskey and unearned confidence. He gripped the microphone like a hard-won trophy, leaning over the table to address the room of elite investors, bankers, and corporate executives. He did not just talk about his love for Whitney. True to his arrogant nature, he turned his own wedding toast into a gloating pitch meeting. "Whitney is absolutely right," Donovan boomed, his voice dripping with unbearable smugness. "Success is about being the smartest guy in the room. It is about knowing how to play the game. And I am immensely proud to announce today, surrounded by my beautiful new wife and my incredible new family, that my firm just officially secured a multi-million-dollar government defense contract." The room erupted in loud, enthusiastic cheers. The investors at the VIP tables clapped aggressively, practically seeing dollar signs raining from the ceiling. Donovan held up his hand to quiet them down, a cruel, mocking smile stretching across his face. "It is funny, really." Donovan continued, shaking his head with a condescending chuckle. "You have all these naive grunts out there crawling in the dirt, risking their necks for absolute pennies. They take orders from useless bureaucrats and think they are making a difference. Meanwhile, the real winners, the guys sitting in this room right now, we make the millions equipping them. We sit in corner offices in custom suits while they do the dirty work. We pull the strings. So here is to the real heroes of America, the innovators, the wealth builders. Cheers. The absolute disrespect radiating from the head table was sickening. He was openly mocking the brave men and women who bled for this country, reducing their ultimate sacrifice to a cheap punchline meant to impress a room full of greedy bankers. Winston laughed the loudest of anyone, raising his glass high in the air to salute his new son-in-law. Beatrice clapped enthusiastically, entirely oblivious to the monumental level of fraud Donovan was currently boasting about. I did not react. I did not stand up and scream. I did not throw my glass or cause a scene. I sat perfectly still at table 42, ignoring the swinging metal kitchen doors, occasionally bumping the back of my chair. I picked up my cheap glass of sparkling water and took a slow, deliberate sip. My right hand rested casually on the matte black briefcase sitting by my feet. With my index finger, I began to tap a specific rhythmic sequence against the biometric lock. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, tap, tap. It was a silent, internal countdown. Donovan was standing on that elevated stage, bragging loudly about a defense contract that I personally knew was riddled with fraudulent billing, phantom equipment deliveries, and illegal kickbacks. It was a contract that my newly commanded department at the Pentagon had been tracking relentlessly for the past 6 months. He truly thought he had outsmarted the United States government. He firmly believed his wealth made him completely untouchable. Donovan raised his glass one more time, shouting for the catering staff to bring another round of vintage champagne for his most important investors. The string quartet raised their bows, preparing to strike up a lively celebratory tune to mark the end of the speeches. But the elegant music never started. First, it was a subtle, deep vibration in the polished hardwood floorboards. It felt like a low rumble beneath the earth. Then the massive crystal chandeliers suspended above the dance floor began to sway violently back and forth, the thousands of glass prisms violently clinking against one another in a chaotic, jarring melody. The polite, sophisticated chatter of the wedding guests faltered instantly, turning into confused, panicked murmurs as people looked up at the shaking ceiling. The vibration rapidly escalated into a deafening, rhythmic, mechanical roar that completely swallowed Donovan's amplified voice. The sound was oppressive, rattling the expensive china on the tables and making the wine ripple in the glasses. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows facing the pristine, perfectly manicured 18th hole of the golf course suddenly darkened as massive shadows fell over the venue. The elite guests began to scream in genuine terror as the undeniable, terrifying sound of twin-turbine military helicopters hovered directly outside, aggressively preparing to touch down right on the pristine green grass. The catastrophic, deafening roar of the twin-turbine engines outside shifted from a high-pitched mechanical whine to a bone-rattling thud. The massive military helicopters were touching down directly on the pristine, perfectly manicured 18th green of the country club. Inside the grand ballroom, the fragile, carefully constructed illusion of East Coast supremacy shattered in an instant. The violent downdraft tore through the venue. Expensive baccarat crystal champagne flutes vibrated off the silk-clothed tables, smashing into hundreds of glittering shards against the polished hardwood floors. The 10-piece string quartet completely abandoned their instruments, cellos and violins clattering to the ground as the musicians scrambled backward in sheer, unadulterated terror. Wealthy investors, men and women who dictated global market trends with the stroke of a pen and destroyed working-class livelihoods for sport, immediately dropped to the floor. They cowered beneath the tables, covering their perfectly coiffed heads with their manicured hands, utterly desperate to shield themselves from the incoming threat. The sheer concussive force of the helicopter rotor wash blew the heavy double-locked French doors wide open, ripping them off their brass latches. The blast sent thousands of imported white orchids swirling wildly into the air like a localized chaotic blizzard, destroying Beatrice's painstakingly designed floral aesthetic in seconds. I sat perfectly still at table 42, surrounded by the terrified catering staff. I did not duck. I did not flinch. My right hand simply rested on the biometric lock of the matte black briefcase by my feet. Winston scrambled to his feet at the head table, nearly knocking over his massive, multi-tiered wedding cake. His face was a mask of furious indignation. He grabbed the microphone Donovan had just dropped, its feedback squealing painfully through the massive speakers. "Security!" Winston bellowed, his voice cracking under the overwhelming mechanical noise. "Get my private security in here right now. I want these people arrested. Lock down the perimeter. Call the police." It was a pathetic, almost comical display of civilian arrogance. Winston genuinely believed his wealth and his corporate title could control any situation, no matter how dire. 4 private security guards wearing cheap black suits and earpieces rushed into the ballroom from the side corridors, reaching for their radios. But the moment they laid eyes on the main entrance, they froze entirely. They did not reach for their weapons. They did not shout commands or assert their supposed authority. They simply lowered their trembling hands and stepped back against the floral-draped walls, entirely paralyzed by the overwhelming lethal force standing on the other side of the threshold. The heavy carved oak doors of the main ballroom entrance did not just open. They were violently kicked apart. The wind from the rotor blades swept through the room, chilling the stagnant, perfumed air and ripping the silk table runners from their moorings. Then the true display of power began. They marched in with absolute terrifying precision. 300 United States Navy SEALs, all dressed in immaculate, sharply pressed dress blues, flooded into the venue. They did not shout. They did not brandish weapons. They did not need to. The synchronized, rhythmic thud of 300 pairs of polished leather boots hitting the hardwood floor in perfect unison was infinitely more intimidating than gunfire. They moved as a single lethal organism, immediately taking absolute control of the massive space. The billionaire guests, the venture capitalists, the elite socialites who had just spent the last hour actively mocking government workers scrambled backward. They plastered themselves against the expensive wallpaper, their eyes wide with unadulterated primal fear. The SEALs moved with surgical, undeniable efficiency. They split into 2 massive columns, completely bypassing the cowering billionaires, and formed a rigid, immovable wall of honor straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. Their faces were carved from stone. Their white gloves and gold buttons gleamed under the violently swinging crystal chandeliers. They created a gauntlet of pure military discipline right through the heart of high society extravagance. At the head table, the panic was palpable. Beatrice grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning stark white, watching her carefully curated social event completely hijacked and destroyed. Whitney gripped her custom silk veil, her mouth hanging open in silent horror. This was her wedding day, her ultimate moment of social triumph, completely overshadowed and obliterated by a military invasion. I watched them all from the shadows near the kitchen doors. I watched the elite crumble when faced with raw, uncompromising discipline. The contrast was staggering. These wealthy investors spent their lives manipulating numbers on a screen, believing that made them untouchable gods. But standing face to face with men forged in the fires of actual warfare, their money suddenly meant absolutely nothing. Donovan was the only person in the room arrogant enough to break the suffocating silence. His ego, inflated by years of buying his way out of consequences, simply could not process the disrespect. He had just been standing on that stage, boasting about his multi-million-dollar defense contracts, claiming he held the absolute leash of the military. Now his wedding reception was occupied territory. He stepped down from the raised platform, his face flushed an ugly mottled shade of crimson. He marched directly toward the center aisle, aggressively confronting the leading officer of the SEAL formation. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Donovan screamed, his voice raw with fury, echoing in the cavernous room. "This is a private, exclusive event. Do you have any idea who I am?" The leading officer did not flinch. He did not even blink. He stared straight ahead, completely ignoring Donovan's furious temper tantrum. "I am Donovan Pierce." Donovan roared, jabbing his index finger aggressively into the officer's chest, his expensive Rolex flashing in the light. "I own the defense contracts that pay your miserable salaries. I sit on the board of companies that manufacture the gear on your backs. I am the reason you even have a job." Now get your men out of my wedding before I make a single phone call and ruin every single one of your pathetic careers. It was a grave, monumental miscalculation. Before Donovan could even withdraw his pointing finger, two SEALs stepped out of the rigid formation. They moved with a terrifying, fluid mechanical speed. They did not draw weapons or raise their voices. They simply flanked Donovan, each grabbing one of his arms with a vice-like grip. The sheer physical power of the soldiers was undeniable and immediate. Donovan gasped. The breath knocked completely out of his lungs as the SEALs effortlessly forced him backward. His expensive custom suit strained against the physical restraint. He tried to struggle, digging the heels of his Italian leather shoes into the hardwood floor, his face twisting in panic, but it was entirely useless. The two soldiers silently, methodically forced the billionaire groom to back away from the center aisle, completely subjugating him without uttering a single syllable. Winston rushed forward to help his new son-in-law, his face twisted in corporate rage, but another SEAL simply turned his head and leveled a freezing, deadly stare at my father. Winston stopped dead in his tracks, his manufactured corporate bravado instantly evaporating under the lethal gaze of a trained killer. Whitney let out a sharp, hysterical shriek from the head table. "Donovan, do something, tell them to leave, call the police." But Donovan was speechless. The man who had just stood on stage mocking the military grunts, calling them mindless pawns, was now being physically restrained by them, his vast wealth and infinite connections completely useless against their silent, organized force. The entire ballroom held its breath, witnessing the total humiliating dismantling of a billionaire's ego in real time. The tension in the room reached an absolute breaking point. The silence was only interrupted by the distant dying whine of the helicopter rotors outside on the ruined golf course. Then a new presence entered the ballroom. He did not march. He walked with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who carried the immense weight of the free world on his shoulders. He wore a perfectly tailored uniform adorned with 4 gleaming stars on the collar, and a chest covered in a dizzying array of colorful commendations medals earned in conflicts these billionaires could only read about in newspapers. His booming voice echoed from the main entrance, slicing through the heavy, terrified atmosphere like a physical blade. "You do not own a damn thing, son," the voice thundered. Admiral Thorne had arrived. He was an absolute legend within the military and intelligence community, a 4-star commander whose strategic brilliance was only matched by his terrifying, uncompromising reputation. The entire ballroom seemed to physically shrink under his immense authoritative presence. He walked slowly down the aisle, stopping at the very beginning of the gauntlet formed by the rigid wall of SEALs. Admiral Thorne slowly turned his head, his sharp, calculating eyes sweeping over the cowering billionaires under the tables, the terrified, sobbing bride, the physically restrained and humiliated groom, and the utterly defeated, trembling Winston. He took in the entire pathetic display of high society arrogance with absolute disgust. Then the Admiral's intense gaze completely bypassed the lavish head table. His eyes locked onto the darkest, furthest corner of the room. He looked directly past the swinging kitchen doors, past the frightened catering staff, and settled his unwavering stare solely on me, sitting quietly at table 42 in my cheap, scratchy gray dress. Admiral Thorne straightened his spine, snapped his heels together with a resounding, echoing crack, and barked a command that shook the very foundations of the elite country club. "Commander on deck." The synchronized, thunderous crack of 300 pairs of polished leather boots snapping together echoed through the devastated ballroom. It was a sound that commanded absolute obedience, a physical shockwave that rippled through the cowering billionaires and venture capitalists. 300 United States Navy SEALs raised their white-gloved hands in a crisp, razor-sharp salute. They did not aim this high military honor at the glittering head table. They did not look at my father, who was desperately gripping his overturned chair, or at Donovan, who remained frozen between two heavily armed operatives. Instead, 300 pairs of highly trained, lethal eyes shifted as one single entity. Their gaze bypassed the imported floral arches, bypassed the weeping bride, and locked squarely onto the darkest, most undesirable corner of the country club. They were looking directly past the swinging kitchen doors. They were looking at table 42. They were looking at me. I slowly stood up. The cheap ash-gray fabric of the ill-fitting dress Beatrice had forced upon me rustled against my legs. It was a garment deliberately chosen to erase my existence, to make me blend into the background, like a forgotten piece of furniture. Yet as I stepped out from the shadows of the catering corridor, that dull gray dress became the focal point of the entire room. The catering staff who had been sharing their break with me just moments prior shrank back against the walls, their mouths hanging open in utter disbelief. I stepped into the center aisle. The massive, rigid gauntlet of seals immediately parted for me, their salutes unwavering, their postures turned to living stone. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute and suffocating, broken only by the steady, rhythmic click of my heels against the hardwood floor. I did not rush. I did not look at the wealthy elites who were currently scraping themselves off the floor, the very same people who had laughed at Donovan's crude jokes about military grunts just 10 minutes ago. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead, carrying the biometric briefcase effortlessly at my side. As I approached the raised platform of the head table, the sheer reality of the situation finally managed to penetrate my mother's thick armor of societal arrogance. Beatrice could not comprehend what she was witnessing. Her brain violently rejected the irrefutable evidence that the daughter she had banished to the shadows was currently commanding the absolute respect of the deadliest military force on Earth. Her face twisted into an ugly, desperate sneer. She lunged forward, her expensive designer heels slipping slightly on the spilled champagne covering the floor. She reached out her manicured fingers shaped into claws, aiming directly for my arm. "What kind of prank is this?" Beatrice hissed, her voice vibrating with a toxic mix of panic and venom. "Stop embarrassing us immediately. Tell these men to leave before you ruin your sister's perfect day." Before her diamond-clad fingers could even graze the cheap fabric of my sleeve, a large, weathered hand intercepted hers with blinding speed. Admiral Thorne swats Beatrice's hand away with a sharp, uncompromising motion. The physical rejection was swift and absolute. Beatrice stumbled backward, clutching her wrist in profound shock. Her mouth opened and closed in silent outrage, completely unaccustomed to anyone denying her physical space. "Ma'am, do not touch a decorated officer," Admiral Thorne barked. His voice did not yell, but it carried the devastating weight of absolute authority. His gaze stripped away her societal armor, instantly rendering her expensive gown, her heavy jewelry, and her country club status utterly worthless. She was nothing more than a civilian interfering with military protocol, and he treated her exactly as such. Whitney shrank back into her plush chair at the head table, pulling her custom silk veil around her shoulders like a shield. Donovan remained completely immobilized by his SEAL captors, his arrogant bravado entirely extinguished. Admiral Thorne stepped past my trembling mother and reached out, plucking the microphone from the stand that Donovan had dropped. The speakers emitted a high-pitched, painful whine of feedback for a brief second before the Admiral gripped it firmly. He turned his broad shoulders to face the entire ballroom, addressing the venture capitalists, the bank executives, and the corporate elite, who were now slowly daring to peek out from under their tables. "We apologize for crashing this private celebration," Admiral Thorne announced, though his steely tone held absolutely zero remorse. "But the United States Navy owes a massive unpayable debt to a woman in this room, and we do not leave our debts unpaid." The Admiral turned to face me. The hardened, terrifying edge of his expression softened into a look of deep, genuine reverence. He raised the microphone again, ensuring every single syllable would be permanently burned into the memories of my family. "5 months ago, during a highly classified extraction in hostile territory, an intelligence unit was ambushed and pinned down by heavy enemy fire," the Admiral stated, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "The situation was critical. Evacuation seemed impossible. But Commander Sloan refused to let her team die in the dirt. When a live fragmentation grenade was thrown into their defensive position, she did not hesitate. She threw her own body over the blast radius to shield 3 of her unit members. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the wealthy crowd. The investors who had just applauded Donovan's mockery of the military were now staring at me with profound, wide-eyed shock. She took a devastating barrage of shrapnel to her shoulder and collarbone. Admiral Thorne continued, his eyes briefly flicking toward Beatrice with undisguised contempt. He knew exactly what had transpired in the bridal suite that morning. My undercover operatives missed nothing. Those injuries are not a cosmetic inconvenience. They are the honorable marks of a true American hero. They are the reason 3 fathers returned home to their children. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. The elite guests slowly turned their heads to look at Beatrice and Whitney. The whispers started instantly. They all realized the horrifying truth. My mother had forced me to wear a high-collared, hideous gray dress to cover up the very scars that I had earned saving American lives. The societal disgust aimed at my mother was palpable, a suffocating wave of judgment that made Beatrice physically wither in her spot. Her cruel, superficial gaslighting had been exposed on a massive, undeniable scale. Admiral Thorne reached into the breast pocket of his decorated uniform. He pulled out a small, dark blue velvet box. He opened it, revealing a heavy bronze cross, suspended from a navy blue and white ribbon. It was the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor in combat that can be awarded to a member of the United States Navy. He stepped forward, bridging the final gap between us. With careful, precise movements, he pinned the prestigious medal directly onto the cheap ash-gray fabric covering my chest. The heavy bronze gleamed brightly under the remaining chandeliers, instantly elevating the hideous garment into a uniform of absolute, undeniable honor. I stood perfectly straight, looking out over the sea of highly trained soldiers and terrified billionaires. Then the true nature of my family revealed itself once again. Winston had been standing frozen near the wedding cake, his face pale and sweating. But as he watched the billionaire investors staring at me with profound awe and deep respect, his corporate survival instincts violently kicked in. His initial shock evaporated in a single heartbeat, instantly replaced by sheer, unadulterated greed. He saw the rapt attention of his wealthy partners. He saw a golden public relations opportunity that could salvage Donovan's disastrous speech and elevate his own firm's standing. Winston furiously straightened his tuxedo jacket. He pasted a wide, manufactured, completely fake smile across his face and shoved his way past the remaining catering staff. He rushed the raised stage, throwing his arms wide open, desperately, preparing to play the deeply proud patriotic father for his captive audience of investors. Winston ascended the carpeted steps of the raised platform with the desperate, frantic energy of a drowning man clawing for a life raft. The entire ballroom was still reeling in a state of collective stunned silence, their eyes fixed firmly on the heavy bronze Navy cross gleaming against my drab gray dress. But my father did not see a decorated military commander. He saw an immediate, highly profitable public relations opportunity. He furiously smoothed the lapels of his custom tuxedo, instantly pasting on the broad, charismatic smile he normally reserved for shareholder meetings and press conferences. The sheer audacity of his pivot was staggering. Just minutes ago, he had banished me to a dark corner by the kitchen doors, actively threatening to destroy me if I embarrassed his wealthy network. Now faced with a room full of elite venture capitalists who were completely mesmerized by a 4-star admiral honoring American valor, Winston saw a chance to claim the glory for himself. Camera flashes began to strobe across the ballroom as the bewildered wealthy guests pulled out their phones, desperate to document the surreal spectacle unfolding before them. Winston practically sprinted the final few feet across the stage, throwing his arms wide open in a grand theatrical gesture of manufactured paternal pride. "My brilliant daughter," Winston boomed, his voice pitched perfectly to carry across the massive room, completely ignoring the wall of 300 heavily armed Navy SEALs surrounding the perimeter. He aimed his approach directly at the cameras, positioning his best profile toward the audience. He intended to wrap his arms around me to pull me into a tight, emotional embrace that would serve as the perfect photograph for tomorrow morning's financial papers. "I always knew she had this inside her," Winston declared to the crowd, his smile blinding his eyes, entirely devoid of actual warmth. "I always pushed her to be a hero. Excellence is the standard in this household. This is a great day for our family business, a testament to the grit and determination we breed." He closed the final foot of distance, bringing the overpowering scent of his expensive cologne right into my personal space. He reached out to grab my shoulders entirely, expecting me to revert to the obedient, terrified teenager I used to be. He calculated that under the blinding glare of the camera flashes and the pressure of polite society, I would simply fall into line and play the role of the grateful daughter. He calculated completely wrong. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply executed a sharp tactical half-step backward, shifting my weight and completely breaking his line of approach. Winston's outstretched arms grasped at empty air. He stumbled awkwardly, his highly polished leather shoes skidding a fraction of an inch across the stage. The temperature on the raised platform seemed to instantly drop to freezing. I looked at him. I did not look at him with the anger of a wounded child or the resentment of a neglected daughter. I looked at him with the absolute freezing detachment of a military commander assessing a hostile threat. My eyes were like chips of glacial ice entirely devoid of any familial affection. "You did not push me, Winston," I said. My voice was not amplified by a microphone, but the ballroom was so deathly quiet that my words carried effortlessly to the front rows of VIP tables. I deliberately used his first name permanently, severing the title of father he was so desperately trying to exploit. Winston froze his arms, dropping awkwardly to his sides. The fake plastic smile remained glued to his face, but his eyes widened in genuine panic. He subtly twitched his head, signaling for me to stop talking, a silent, frantic command to play along. I held his terrified gaze and delivered the kill shot with absolute unwavering precision. "You disowned me," I stated, my voice ringing out like a judge delivering a final sentence. "You threw me out of your house. You looked me dead in the eye and told me I was entirely dead to you. And you did it specifically because I refused to forge federal tax documents for your firm." The reaction in the grand ballroom was instantaneous and completely devastating. The word forge dropped into the crowd of billionaires and bankers like a live hand grenade. The polite awe-struck silence shattered immediately, replaced by a frantic, low hum of panicked whispering. Venture capitalists who had just invested tens of millions of dollars into Winston's corporate portfolio suddenly sat up straight, their faces draining of color. Board members exchanged terrified, wide-eyed glances. The elite socialites at the front tables gasped physically, leaning away from the stage as if Winston had just caught fire. In the world of high finance, rumors of tax fraud were an absolute death sentence. To have that accusation delivered by a decorated military commander standing next to a four-star admiral was an extinction-level event. Winston's manufactured smile violently collapsed. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. Sweat instantly beaded on his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair. He looked frantically at the VIP tables, watching his life's work, his precious reputation, and his financial empire evaporate in real time. "Now, Sloane, let us not be dramatic," Winston stammered, his voice pitching up into a high, nervous squeak. He let out a loud, hollow, desperate laugh, waving his hands at the crowd as if trying to physically erase the words from the air. "You know how she is, everyone. Combat stress. The military sense of humor is just so dark. She is just making a little family joke." No one laughed. Not a single person in the massive room even offered a polite chuckle. The 300 Navy SEALs lining the aisles shifted their posture ever so slightly, a subtle, terrifying ripple of physical intimidation that made the billionaires shrink back into their chairs. Admiral Thorne stood completely motionless behind me, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression radiating absolute lethal contempt for the man sweating in front of him. I did not waste another second looking at Winston. He was no longer a threat. He was a neutralized target. I turned my back on my father, leaving him stammering and drowning in the wreckage of his own reputation. I walked with slow, deliberate purpose across the raised stage, heading directly toward the massive 5-tier wedding cake positioned near the center of the platform. Whitney let out a tiny, pathetic squeak as I approached, pressing herself deep into the back of her plush chair, completely terrified of the sister she had spent the entire morning mocking. Beatrice remained frozen near the edge of the stage, her mouth hanging open, still clutching her wrist where the Admiral had swatted her away. I reached the cake table. I hoisted the heavy matte black briefcase and slammed it down firmly onto the pristine white linen tablecloth right next to the towering sugar orchids. The heavy thud made the crystal cake stand rattle. I placed my right thumb directly onto the glowing blue biometric scanner built into the handle. The machine emitted a sharp, high-pitched beep. A small green light flashed and the heavy internal steel latches released with a loud, satisfying mechanical clack. I flipped the lid open. Inside, resting on precision-cut foam, was a massive stack of highly classified documents. I reached in and pulled out the primary dossier. It was nearly 3 inches thick, bound in heavy manila stock. Stamped across the front cover, in massive, bold, unforgiving red ink, was the official seal of the Department of Defense, flanked by the distinct, unmistakable crest of the Pentagon. I gripped the dossier tightly in my left hand, the Navy Cross resting proudly against my chest. I turned my attention away from the cake, away from my ruined parents, and locked my gaze directly onto the groom. Donovan was currently flanked by the 2 massive Navy SEALs who had neutralized his earlier tantrum. He was no longer the arrogant, untouchable billionaire who had proudly mocked the military grunts from his VIP podium. He was completely trapped, pinned in place by men who could snap his neck without breaking a sweat. His custom-tailored, outrageously expensive tuxedo was completely ruined, heavily stained with dark spreading patches of nervous sweat under his arms and around his collar. His chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. I walked slowly toward the edge of the stage, stopping directly above him. I looked down into his terrified, bloodshot eyes. "Speaking of your business," I said, my voice carrying a lethal, icy promise that echoed into every single corner of the silent ballroom. "Let us talk about where Donovan's millions actually come from." I pulled a thick, heavy, red-stamped financial ledger from the center of the Pentagon dossier. I held it up for a fraction of a second, letting the gold seal catch the light of the chandeliers before I threw it directly onto the pristine white linen of the cake table. The heavy binder hit the wood with a loud smack, sliding just inches away from Donovan's ruined, sweat-stained tuxedo. I looked him dead in the eye, my gaze carrying the freezing weight of absolute certainty. Donovan's venture capital firm does not create anything, I announced, ensuring my voice carried to the very back of the room where the investors were actively pulling out their phones to record this disaster. You do not innovate. You do not build. You act as a parasitic, corrupt middleman. You purchase substandard, practically defective tactical gear from overseas shell companies. You slap a patriotic logo on the crates, inflate the prices by a staggering 10,000%, and sell them directly to the Department of Defense. Donovan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. Whitney finally found her voice, stepping forward with her hands balled into tight, shaking fists. "Stop lying!" Whitney shrieked, her face flushed with misplaced indignation and panic. "Donovan is a genius. He works 70 hours a week building this portfolio. You are just jealous because you are wearing a cheap rag and he is a billionaire." I ignored my sister entirely, keeping my focus locked on the man sweating profusely between the 2 Navy SEALs. "It gets worse." I continued tapping the cover of the ledger with my index finger. Because Donovan does not just steal taxpayer money. He needs a domestic manufacturing partner to legitimize the paperwork to make it look like this gear is built on American soil. So he kicks back 30% of his fraudulent federal funds directly into the accounts of Wilson Manufacturing. A collective, horrified gasp echoed through the ballroom. The elite guests, the very people who had just been drinking Donovan's vintage champagne and praising his business acumen, physically recoiled. Whispers erupted across the room like a sudden wildfire. "You and my father have been running a highly coordinated illegal kickback scheme," I stated, my voice ringing with undeniable truth. "You buy cheap, faulty ceramic plates for ballistic vests. You funnel the money through Winston's corporate accounts to wash it clean. And because of your bottom line, because you wanted to afford a $1 million wedding and custom Italian suits, men and women in my unit were sent into hostile combat zones wearing armor that shatters on the first impact." For a brief, agonizing moment, Donovan looked like he was going to vomit. His eyes darted toward the exits, calculating a route of escape that simply did not exist. But then the sheer ingrained arrogance of a man born into limitless wealth violently rejected the reality of his situation. He violently jerked his shoulders, trying unsuccessfully to shake off the grip of the two operatives holding him in place. When he realized physical resistance was completely futile, he resorted to the only weapon he had left in his arsenal: his massive, fragile ego. He scoffed a wet, ugly sound that echoed over the dead silence of the room. He threw his head back and let out a harsh, mocking laugh, trying desperately to project confidence to his panicked investors. "You are completely out of your mind," Donovan sneered, his lip curling in profound disgust. "You are just a grunt Sloan. A glorified foot soldier with a ridiculous savior complex. You crawl around in the dirt and take orders, and you think that gives you the right to walk into a room full of actual power and make demands. You do not understand the first thing about high finance. You do not comprehend how global economics work." He leaned forward as far as the seals would allow, his eyes blazing with toxic, desperate superiority. "Those contracts are ironclad," he spat, his voice dropping into a menacing register. "They were drafted by the sharpest corporate lawyers in the country. They were signed, sealed, and approved by generals and senators who attend my dinner parties. You think a little red-stamped folder means anything to me? I have politicians on speed dial. I have federal judges in my pocket. You cannot touch me." Beatrice, sensing a slight shift in the momentum, quickly seized the opportunity to defend her golden ticket. "She is delusional," Beatrice announced loudly, turning to the crowd with a frantic, pleading smile. "My daughter has always been prone to these hysterical, jealous outbursts. She is clearly suffering from post-traumatic stress. We need to get her medical help immediately, not listen to these completely baseless, fabricated accusations. She is just acting out because she feels left out of the celebration." Donovan nodded vigorously, his manufactured confidence returning in full force. He looked at Admiral Thorne, attempting a man-to-man conspiratorial grin. "Admiral, with all due respect, your officer here is clearly having a severe mental break. I highly suggest you escort her to a psychiatric facility before my legal team files a defamation lawsuit that will absolutely bankrupt her and bring a massive scandal to the Navy." "I am untouchable, Sloan. You brought a prop to a boardroom." I did not flinch at his threats. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic, desperate screaming. I did not offer a single word of defense against my mother's pathetic gaslighting. I simply stood there, letting the silence stretch until it became utterly suffocating for the groom. Then I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a cold, predatory, razor-sharp expression that made the blood instantly drain from Donovan's face once again. "I am not just a grunt anymore, Donovan," I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly measured. I slowly reached into the inside pocket of my cheap gray dress, bypassing the rough fabric that rubbed against my newly pinned Navy cross. I pulled out a solid, heavy gold badge and a thick, laminated federal identification card. I dropped them directly on top of his fraudulent financial ledger. The gold seal of the Department of Defense gleamed brightly under the remaining chandeliers, casting a long, terrible shadow over Donovan's future. As of 0800 hours this morning, I was officially appointed as the Director of DoD Contract Audits for the Eastern Seaboard. I announced, watching the absolute horror wash over his features. "I am the highest-ranking civilian military liaison in this sector. I do not just carry a rifle anymore, Donovan. I carry the entire auditing authority of the United States federal government. I am the person who reviews, investigates, and terminates the very contracts you claim are ironclad." The air in the ballroom vanished completely. It was as if a massive vacuum had sucked all the oxygen out of the space. The venture capitalists who had backed Donovan's firm began urgently whispering to their assistants, ordering them to dump their shares and sever all ties immediately. They were scrambling over one another, terrified of being caught in the blast radius of a federal fraud investigation. Winston literally collapsed. His knees simply gave out, and he fell heavily into a velvet dining chair. He buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a wretched, guttural moan as his entire financial empire disintegrated in front of his eyes. He realized in that exact moment that the daughter he had banished to Table 42 now held the power to seize every single asset he owned. Admiral Thorne stepped forward, his massive presence reinforcing my words and utterly destroying Donovan's final shred of hope. Commander Sloan was specifically selected for this role because of her unparalleled integrity and her first-hand experience with the devastating consequences of corporate greed on the battlefield. The Admiral stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. She answers directly to the Secretary of Defense. Your connections mean absolutely nothing here. Whitney burst into loud, ugly tears, her meticulously applied makeup running down her face in dark streaks. She realized with crushing clarity that her billionaire husband was currently transforming into a federal inmate, and her life of limitless luxury was entirely over. Donovan shook his head rapidly back and forth, completely unable to process the total destruction of his reality. No, Donovan gasped, his voice barely a terrified whisper. No, you cannot do this. You do not have the clearance. I will call my lawyers. I will call the governor. I ignored his pathetic stammering. I reached into the breast pocket of my dress one final time and pulled out a heavy federal-issue solid metal pen. I clicked the cap with a sharp, decisive snap that echoed loudly over the absolute silence of the ballroom. I flipped the thick ledger open to the very first page, revealing the master list of every single defense contract Donovan's firm currently held. Millions of dollars in taxpayer money, all built on a foundation of absolute lies, kickbacks, and shattered armor. And my first official act in my new civilian military liaison role? I said, pressing the tip of the pen firmly against the thick paper. I locked my eyes onto his terrified, trembling face. Let us talk about where Donovan's millions actually come from. I am canceling every single contract your firm holds due to federal fraud. The words hung in the air, absolute and irrevocable. Donovan's mind violently rejected the reality of his immediate destruction. The smug, untouchable veneer he had worn like armor for his entire adult life shattered into a million jagged pieces. He let out a feral, completely unhinged scream, the sound tearing through the grand ballroom and silencing the frantic whispers of the crowd. You cannot do this to me! Donovan bellowed, his face turning an ugly mottled shade of crimson. He lunged forward, his hands hooking into desperate claws, aiming directly for the heavy federal pen in my grip. You are breaching protocol. You are ruining my entire life. You have no idea who you are dealing with. I will have you court-martialed. I will have you destroyed. He never even made it past the edge of the tablecloth. The two Navy SEALs flanking him moved with a terrifying synchronized fluidity. They did not shout warnings. They did not hesitate. They simply boxed him in with bone-crushing tactical force. One operative drove a heavy boot behind Donovan's knee, forcing his leg to buckle instantly with a sharp crack. The other operative gripped Donovan's custom-tailored shoulder and drove him face-first into the polished hardwood floor. The sickening thud of expensive bone-meeting solid oak echoed across the raised platform. Donovan thrashed wildly, screaming about his lawyers, his political connections, and his offshore bank accounts. But the SEALs pressed their weight into him, rendering him entirely immobile. His cheek was smashed against the spilled champagne, his designer suit ripping at the seams. He was nothing more than a squirming, helpless fraud pinned beneath the weight of actual military discipline. The sight of the billionaire groom physically restrained on the floorboards finally broke the spell, holding the audience captive. The venture capitalists, bank executives, and corporate partners began a frantic, chaotic stampede toward the exits. It was a mass exodus of the elite. Men in tuxedos tripped over overturned chairs, frantically dialing their brokers, shouting panicked orders into their phones to liquidate assets, dump shares, and sever all financial ties to Donovan and Winston before the federal indictments became public record. Winston watched his wealthy partners fleeing the ballroom. He watched his entire network of elite investors running away from him as if he were carrying a lethal plague. The realization of his absolute financial ruin struck him with the physical force of a freight train. He stumbled forward, his legs giving out completely. He dropped heavily to his knees right at the edge of the stage, his trousers tearing against a stray piece of broken crystal. He crawled forward, his hands grasping desperately at the hem of my cheap gray dress. His face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. "Sloan, you do not understand what you are doing," Winston gasped, his voice trembling with breathless panic. He looked out at the fleeing crowd, then back to me, the mask of the proud, untouchable patriarch completely stripped away. He was left as nothing but a hollow, desperate shell of a corporate parasite. I leveraged everything on Donovan's defense contracts, Winston confessed. His voice echoed over the microphone Admiral Thorne still held loosely at his side, broadcasting his frantic admission loudly over the sound system and permanently sealing his fate to anyone still listening in the room. I put up the entire estate. I leveraged the manufacturing company. I drained the executive pension funds to cover the initial kickbacks and the offshore shell companies. I bet it all on this merger. Everything depends on those federal payouts. Tears of pure panic streamed down my father's meticulously manicured face, ruining his complexion. He clasped his hands together in a pathetic, trembling gesture of prayer, looking up at me, as if I were a deity capable of stopping an avalanche. If you sign that cancellation order, the federal auditors will freeze our accounts immediately. Winston sobbed, his chest heaving. The banks will call in the massive loans. The board of directors will demand an immediate federal inquiry. We go completely bankrupt by Monday morning. I will lose the firm. I will lose the houses. Sloan, I am begging you. Look at me. We are family. We are blood. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. You cannot destroy your own father. I looked down at the man begging at my feet. I studied the abject terror in his eyes, the absolute desperation of a man who had measured his entire worth in dollars and social status, now facing a zero balance and a federal prison cell. I searched myself for a flicker of emotion. I waited to feel a shred of pity, a pang of familial guilt, or even the hot rush of vindication. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no anger, just the cold, sterile satisfaction of neutralizing a severe threat to the United States Navy. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face level with his sweating, tear-streaked features. My voice was a sharp tactical blade, cutting effortlessly through his frantic pleas. You told me a long time ago that blood means absolutely nothing without a solid return on investment, I said, repeating the exact philosophy he had used to justify throwing me out of his house and erasing me from his life 5 years ago. You looked me in the eye and said family was just another corporate asset to be managed, and that I was a liability you could no longer afford to carry. Winston opened his mouth, trying to backtrack, trying to find a lie or a manipulation that would save him, but his throat was completely dry. No sound came out. Consider this my final return on your investment, I stated. I stood up perfectly straight and turned my back on him. I needed a hard, flat surface to execute the federal document. My eyes landed on the pristine white leather-bound wedding registry, sitting next to the towering floral arrangements. It was a book filled with the elegant signatures of the elite guests who had just fled the building, a physical manifestation of the fake corrupt empire they were trying to build today. I grabbed the registry, flipped it open to a blank page right in the very center, and placed the heavy federal cancellation order directly on top of it. I pressed the heavy metal pen to the paper. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I signed my name with sharp, precise strokes authorizing the immediate, irrevocable termination of every single fraudulent defense contract Donovan held. The dark ink bled into the thick paper, serving as a permanent, undeniable death warrant for their corrupt enterprise. I closed the thick ledger with a loud, authoritative snap. I turned and handed the entire dossier directly to Admiral Thorne. He accepted the document with a crisp, respectful nod, stepping back to immediately initiate the federal lockdown procedures and dispatch the audit teams. It was done. The financial execution was absolute and irreversible. The terrifying reality of the situation finally managed to penetrate Whitney's thick cloud of denial and arrogance. She had been sitting frozen in her plush chair at the head table, clutching her silk veil, watching the rapid, systematic destruction of her perfect wedding, her billionaire groom, and her father's empire. But as she watched me hand over the signed document to the Admiral, the sheer gravity of her new reality crashed down upon her shoulders, crushing her completely. She was not marrying a billionaire. She was legally tied to a federal criminal who was currently bleeding on the floor. There would be no private jets. There would be no sprawling penthouses in Manhattan. There would be no high society galas or endless shopping sprees in Paris. The custom designer gowns, the massive diamond rings, the imported champagne. It was all vanishing before her very eyes, instantly replaced by the looming specter of total bankruptcy, frozen assets, and federal investigations. The shock on her beautiful, meticulously contoured face twisted into something incredibly dark, ugly, and completely feral. The spoiled, entitled bride who had built her entire identity on superiority, cruelty, and vast wealth realized she now had absolutely nothing left. Her glittering glass castle had shattered into dust, leaving her standing barefoot in the jagged ruins. She let out an ear-piercing, unhinged shriek of pure, unadulterated rage. Her manicured hands curled into tight claws, ripping at the expensive silk of her own wedding dress. Her eyes darted frantically around the ruined stage, seeking a target for her absolute devastation. Whitney's perfectly constructed illusion of a fairy tale wedding shattered completely, replaced by the terrifying cold reality of absolute financial ruin. The delicate imported silk of her custom designer gown suddenly felt like a straitjacket. The millions of dollars worth of diamonds dripping from her neck and wrists no longer felt like a crown. They felt like heavy physical chains linking her directly to a sinking ship. She stared at Donovan, the man she had just sworn to love forever, the man who was currently pinned to the oak floorboards by two heavily armed Navy SEALs, his custom tuxedo ruined with sweat and spilled champagne. She did not see her husband. She saw a massive, catastrophic liability. Her meticulously applied makeup cracked as her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She let out a shrill, ear-piercing shriek that cut right through the chaotic din of the fleeing billionaires. "You lied to me!" Whitney screamed, her voice completely devoid of any bridal joy. She grabbed a crystal champagne flute from the head table and hurled it violently toward the floor, the delicate glass shattering into 1,000 pieces near Donovan's head. "You told me you were invincible. You told me this firm was untouchable. We were supposed to fly to Monaco tonight. We were supposed to close on the Manhattan penthouse next week." Donovan thrashed weakly against the seals, trying to lift his head, his face bruised and swelling from the impact with the floor. "Whitney, please!" he gasped, spitting blood onto the polished oak. "Just calm down. I can fix this. I have offshore accounts. I have emergency funds in the Caymans. Just call my lawyer." Whitney did not calm down. She stepped closer to the edge of the raised platform, her hands curling into tight, shaking fists, her manicured nails digging into her palms. She looked down at him with an expression of absolute withering disgust. "Fix this!" Whitney shrieked, her voice vibrating with manic fury. "She just canceled every single federal contract you hold. She is a director for the Department of Defense. You are going to federal prison, Donovan. Your assets are going to be frozen by the end of the day. If you are broke, what is the point of this wedding? What is the point of any of this?" Her words hung in the air, a stark, brutal admission of her true character. She did not care about Donovan. She did not care about the vows they had exchanged just hours ago. She only cared about the billions of dollars that had just evaporated into thin air. Donovan's frantic, desperate pleading stopped abruptly. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He stared up at his new bride, the woman who had happily spent millions of his stolen money on floral arrangements and imported caviar, and saw the absolute, undeniable truth. She was abandoning ship the exact second the money ran dry. His terror instantly hardened into vicious, toxic anger. "You superficial, greedy little parasite!" Donovan spat, his voice laced with pure venom. "You think you can just walk away from me now? You think you are innocent in all of this? Who do you think paid for that dress? Who do you think paid for that ring on your finger? That is my money, Whitney. My money." Donovan strained against the operatives, his eyes locking onto the massive 10-carat diamond engagement ring, catching the light on Whitney's trembling hand. "Give it back," Donovan demanded, his voice a harsh, guttural bark. "Give me the ring back right now. I am going to need every single cent to pay my legal defense team. Take it off." Whitney gasped instinctively, pulling her hand to her chest, her fingers curling protectively over the massive diamond. Are you completely out of your mind? She screamed, her voice echoing through the rapidly emptying ballroom. This is my ring. It was a gift. You gave it to me. I bought it with corporate funds, you idiot! Donovan yelled back, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. It belongs to the firm. And since the firm is currently being audited by the federal government, that ring is a corporate asset. Take it off before they seize it. The grand, elegant head table adorned with cascading white orchids and imported silk runners instantly transformed into a vicious, humiliating battleground. The golden couple, the envy of elite high society, began tearing each other apart with absolute, unrestrained savagery. Whitney lunged forward, grabbing a heavy silver serving platter and throwing it blindly at Donovan. It missed him completely, crashing into a stack of crystal plates and sending shards of glass flying across the stage. I am not giving you anything! Whitney shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. You ruined my life. You ruined my wedding. I am filing for annulment the second I walk out of these doors. You are a fraud, Donovan. A pathetic, broke fraud. You are nothing without me! Donovan roared back, struggling violently against the seals, desperate to reach her. You are just a cheap social climber who married a bank account. You think anyone is going to look at you twice when they find out you are married to a federal inmate? You are going down with me, Whitney. I will make sure of it. They screamed at each other, their voices raw and filled with years of suppressed resentment and toxic ambition, completely ignoring the fact that they were surrounded by 300 heavily armed military operatives and a scattering of terrified catering staff. I did not intervene. I did not step forward to calm my sister down or demand order. I simply stood near the center of the stage, my hands resting lightly at my sides, and watched the absolute chaos unfold with a profound sense of freezing calm. For my entire life, I had been told that Whitney and Donovan were the ultimate standard of success. I had been told that their wealth, their status, and their flawless public image were the only things that truly mattered in the world. Winston and Beatrice had constantly weaponized their relationship, using it as a blunt instrument to highlight my own supposed failures. Now I was watching that perfect glittering illusion destroy itself from the inside out. They were like two rabid animals trapped in a cage, tearing each other to pieces over the scraps of a fraudulent empire. Their bond was not built on love or respect or loyalty. It was built entirely on greed, and the moment the money vanished, the bond dissolved into pure, unfiltered hatred. I let them scream. I let them fight. I let them expose their true ugly colors to the entire world. It was a fitting, necessary conclusion to a life built entirely on lies. The remaining elite guests, those who hadn't already fled the ballroom in sheer terror, stood frozen near the exits, their phones raised high, capturing every single second of the humiliating implosion. Tomorrow morning, this footage would be broadcast across every major news network in the country. The golden couple of high finance would be exposed as the ultimate frauds. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing shriek cut through the chaotic noise, momentarily silencing Whitney and Donovan's vicious argument. Beatrice scrambled up the carpeted steps of the raised stage, her expensive designer heels clicking frantically against the hardwood. Her face was flushed an ugly shade of crimson, her eyes wide and wild with absolute desperation. She had spent decades meticulously constructing her perfect social standing, clawing her way to the very top of the country club hierarchy. She could not comprehend the fact that her entire world was collapsing in a matter of minutes. She needed a scapegoat, she needed a distraction, she needed to save face no matter the cost. Beatrice lunged toward the microphone stand, shoving past a bewildered catering manager. She gripped the microphone tightly in her manicured hands, her knuckles turning white. She turned to face the remaining audience, her eyes locking onto me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Do not listen to a single word she says, Beatrice screamed into the microphone, her voice amplified and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Sloane is completely mentally unstable. She has always been jealous of her sister. She is a sick, delusional girl making up these ridiculous lies to ruin Whitney's special day. The ballroom fell into a stunned, heavy silence. Even Whitney and Donovan stopped fighting, staring at Beatrice in absolute shock. She is a thief! Beatrice shrieked, her voice vibrating with toxic panic. She pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at me. She stole her sister's entire college fund years ago. That is why we had to throw her out. She is a criminal. Someone call the police immediately. Arrest her before she does any more damage." The echo of Beatrice's frantic command bounced off the vaulted ceilings hanging in the stifling air of the ballroom. She stood near the edge of the stage, her chest heaving, pointing a manicured, trembling finger directly at me. When no one immediately moved to follow her orders, her panic morphed into a manic, desperate frenzy. She was watching decades of meticulously constructed social engineering burn to the ground, and her survival instincts demanded that she control the narrative at any cost. Beatrice lunged toward a terrified catering manager who was huddled near the kitchen doors. She grabbed the young man by the lapels of his uniform, violently shaking him. "Call 911 right now?" Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Tell them we have an intruder. Tell them we have a deranged woman impersonating a military officer. Look at her. Look at these men. This is a sick, elaborate prank. These uniforms are cheap rentals. She hired a bunch of thugs to crash her sister's wedding because she is a bitter, resentful failure." The catering manager physically pried himself out of her grip, stumbling backward and raising his hands in surrender before sprinting out the service exit. Beatrice spun back around to face the remaining audience. The elite socialites, the country club board members, and the few venture capitalists who had not yet fled were staring at her with a mixture of profound shock and morbid fascination. "She is delusional," Beatrice announced to the crowd, clasping her hands together in a theatrical display of maternal sorrow. "She has always been deeply unwell. We tried to hide it to protect our family's good name. But she broke my heart. She ran away in the middle of the night when she turned 18, and she did not leave empty-handed. She emptied her sister's college fund. She took $200,000 of our hard-earned money and vanished into the gutter. We wept for her. We prayed for her. And this is how she repays us, by staging this fake military stunt to terrorize us." Admiral Thorne shifted his considerable weight. His weathered face darkened into a terrifying scowl. He took a single heavy step toward Beatrice, his presence radiating the lethal coiled energy of a seasoned combat veteran. "Ma'am," the Admiral growled, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, quiet authority, "you are publicly accusing a highly decorated federal officer of a felony, and you are entirely disrespecting the uniform of the United States Navy. One more word and I will personally have my men detain you for interfering with a federal investigation." Beatrice shrank back, her mouth snapping shut. The sheer physical reality of the Admiral finally broke through her delusion. She could not gaslight a 4-star commander. I held up my hand, signaling the Admiral to hold his position. I did not need the United States military to fight this particular battle. This was personal. This was the final rotting pillar of my family's foundation, and I was going to tear it down myself. I stepped away from the ruined wedding cake and walked slowly toward Beatrice. She instinctively backed away from me, her expensive designer heels catching on the carpeted steps. "You want to talk about the college fund, Beatrice?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. The acoustics of the grand ballroom carried my words perfectly, ensuring that every single remaining guest heard the undeniable clarity in my tone. "You want to talk about the $200,000 trust fund that grandmother left specifically in my name, the one you just claimed I drained before running away into the night?" Beatrice lifted her chin, attempting to summon her old arrogant authority. "You are a thief, Sloane," she hissed, though her eyes darted nervously toward the biometric briefcase I had left on the table. "You stole from your own blood. You took that money and wasted it." I smiled. It was a cold, clinical expression. Gaslighters always relied on emotion, on twisting the truth, until the victim questioned their own sanity. But I had spent the last 5 years operating in a world defined by absolute precision. I did not bring emotion to this fight. I brought data. I walked back to the heavy black briefcase. I reached into the secondary compartment and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope bearing the distinct, recognizable logo of one of the largest national banks in the country. I held it up high, letting the bright artificial light illuminate the federal certification stamps. "Grandma knew exactly who you were, Beatrice," I stated, turning to face the audience. "That is why her will stipulated that the trust was completely locked until the day of my 18th birthday. You could not touch a single cent of it while I was a minor." But on the exact day I turned 18, a withdrawal slip was processed at a local branch right here in Massachusetts, completely emptying the account. I ripped the seal off the envelope. I pulled out a stack of high-definition color-printed bank statements and forensic documents. It is a fascinating piece of timing. I continued pacing slowly across the stage. Because on the morning of my 18th birthday, I was entirely locked inside a military quarantine zone at Great Lakes Naval Station. I was undergoing initial intake processing. I was surrounded by drill instructors completely stripped of my civilian clothes and entirely cut off from the outside world. I did not have a phone. I did not have internet access. And I certainly was not standing in a bank lobby in Boston. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the ballroom. The wealthy guests leaned forward, completely captivated by the irrefutable paper trail unfolding before them. Yet miraculously, a withdrawal slip was signed and authorized, I said, holding up a blown-up image of the banking document. I requested a federal audit of this specific account last month through my DoD clearance. The handwriting analysts at the Bureau confirmed the truth in under 10 minutes. The signature was a complete sloppy forgery. Beatrice's face drained of all color. She looked like a ghost wrapped in expensive silk. She took another step backward, shaking her head rapidly, desperately trying to find a way out of the corner she had painted herself into. But the truly fascinating part of the federal audit is where the routing numbers lead. I announced, my voice slicing through the tension like a scalpel. Because $200,000 does not just disappear. It leaves a very distinct, very traceable electronic footprint. I flipped to the next page of the audit. I looked directly at Whitney, who was still weeping on the floor next to Donovan. $80,000 was wired directly from my trust account to a highly exclusive private cosmetic surgery clinic in Beverly Hills. I read aloud, watching Whitney freeze in absolute horror. The transaction occurred exactly 2 weeks before Whitney miraculously returned from her supposed spiritual wellness retreat in Europe, with a brand new nose, a reconstructed jawline, and a completely different profile. Whitney let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She covered her face with her hands, curling into a tight ball on the floor. Her carefully maintained high society image was instantly pulverized. She had lied to her entire social circle about her appearance for years, and now they all knew her vanity was funded by money stolen from her teenage sister. The snickers and whispered judgments from the elite guests were immediate and completely ruthless. And the remaining $120,000, I continued shifting my gaze to Winston, who was still kneeling weakly by the edge of the stage, wired directly to a luxury exotic car broker. The funds were used to purchase a pristine, vintage Porsche 911, the exact same silver Porsche that is currently parked in Winston's reserved spot at this very country club. The exposure was total and absolute. Beatrice and Winston were stripped bare before the very society they worshipped. They were not wealthy elites. They were not brilliant business minds. They were common, desperate thieves who had robbed their own neglected child to fund their pathetic, superficial lifestyle. The societal disgust aimed at my parents was a palpable, crushing weight. Beatrice realized in a single terrifying heartbeat that she had absolutely no exit. Her lies were dead. Her reputation was incinerated. She could not scream her way out of federal bank fraud. She looked around at the faces of the country club members, seeing nothing but utter contempt and mockery. Unable to handle the reality of her shattered existence, Beatrice resorted to her ultimate final defense mechanism. She dramatically gasped for air, clutching her diamond necklace with both hands. Her eyes rolled into the back of her head, and she collapsed onto the carpeted stage in a theatrical, highly exaggerated swoon, faking a dead faint to escape the suffocating judgment of the room. Winston, seeing his wife go down and realizing that the exposure of the bank fraud combined with his impending federal defense contract indictments meant he was going to die in a prison cell, instantly followed suit. He grabbed his chest, his face contorting into a mask of sudden agony. He fell backward, crashing hard against the cake table and sending the entire 5-tier wedding cake toppling onto the floor in a massive explosion of white frosting and sugar orchids. "Call an ambulance!" Winston bellowed from the floor, writhing in the ruined cake and clutching his tuxedo shirt. "My heart, she is killing me. My own daughter is giving me a fatal heart attack. Help me." The silence that followed his theatrical cry was deafening. Winston thrashed wildly amidst the ruins of the five-tier vanilla buttercream cake, smearing expensive white frosting across his custom Italian tuxedo. He clutched the fabric over his left pectoral muscle, his face twisting into a grotesque mask of manufactured agony. He let out a series of ragged, wet gasps, tossing his head back against the polished floorboards. Whitney immediately seized the opportunity to redirect the narrative. She crawled over the debris of her shattered fairy tale, her own designer gown stained with spilled champagne and crushed sugar orchids, and positioned herself squarely between me and her allegedly dying father. "You are a murderer!" Whitney shrieked, her voice tearing through the grand ballroom with unhinged ferocity. Her eyes were wide, darting frantically around the room, desperately trying to manipulate the remaining crowd into sympathy. "Look at what you are doing to him. You are literally killing our father. You march in here with your fake federal badges and your psychotic lies, and you are giving him a fatal heart attack. You have always been a monster, Sloane. You could never stand to see us happy, and now you are a murderer." Beatrice, who had been lying perfectly still in her fake swoon just a few feet away, miraculously found the strength to crack one eyelid open. She peered through her false eyelashes, scanning the room to see if Winston's dramatic medical emergency was successfully shifting the blame. It was a pathetic, transparent display of synchronized gaslighting. They had operated this way for decades, creating massive emotional crises whenever they were backed into a corner, forcing everyone around them to abandon logic and rush to their rescue. I did not move a single muscle. I stood towering over the ruined stage, my posture perfectly rigid, my face an impenetrable mask of absolute calm. I had seen real trauma. I had seen men bleed out in the dust of foreign combat zones. I knew exactly what a dying man looked like, and Winston Wilson was not dying. He was simply facing the first real consequence of his entire privileged life, and his fragile system was resorting to a childish temper tantrum to avoid accountability. "Somebody call an ambulance!" Whitney screamed again, her voice cracking. "Are you all just going to stand there and watch this monster kill a good man?" Admiral Thorne let out a low rumbling scoff that vibrated with profound disgust. He did not reach for his radio. He did not order a tactical evacuation. He simply raised his massive calloused hand and snapped his fingers once. The sharp, decisive sound cut right through Whitney's hysterical sobbing. A Navy combat medic who had been standing silently by the perimeter doors with the security detail stepped forward instantly. He was a broad-shouldered, imposing man in full tactical uniform, his face carved from pure granite. He did not run. He did not rush. He moved with the terrifying, deliberate precision of a man who routinely operated under heavy enemy fire. He bypassed the panicked wedding guests, stepped over a shattered crystal vase, and vaulted effortlessly onto the raised stage. He unclipped a heavy olive-drab medical kit from his shoulder and dropped it directly next to Winston's head. The heavy canvas bag hit the floorboards with a loud, authoritative thud, causing Winston to flinch violently and break his theatrical performance for a fraction of a second. "We have a medical professional right here," Admiral Thorne announced, his voice projecting across the ballroom like a foghorn. "Let us see exactly how fatal this heart attack really is." Winston, realizing a trained military medic was about to examine him, desperately tried to amplify his symptoms. He began taking short, rapid breaths, clutching his chest even tighter, and rolling his eyes backward. "The pain," Winston groaned, squeezing his eyes shut. "It is crushing me. My left arm is going numb. She did this to me." The combat medic ignored the amateur dramatics completely. He did not offer words of comfort. He did not hold Winston's hand or tell him everything was going to be all right. He simply knelt in the ruined cake, his tactical pants absorbing the vanilla frosting, and went to work with ruthless efficiency. He ripped open his medical bag and pulled out a digital blood pressure cuff and a portable pulse oximeter. Without asking for permission, he grabbed Winston's flailing left arm, pinned it firmly to the floor with one hand, and expertly wrapped the cuff around his bicep. Winston let out a sharp yelp of protest at the physical restraint, but the medic simply tightened the Velcro with a harsh, tearing sound. "Hold still, sir," the medic ordered, his voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. He clipped the pulse oximeter onto Winston's index finger. The small machine immediately lit up, emitting a steady, rhythmic beep, that echoed loudly in the silent ballroom. The steady, perfectly even tempo of the electronic beep completely contradicted the frantic, dying gasps Winston was forcing from his throat. The medic pressed a button on the blood pressure monitor. The machine hummed to life, inflating the cuff tightly around Winston's arm. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. The venture capitalists, the elite socialites, the country club, board members, they all stood frozen in place, watching the digital screen on the medic's equipment as if it were a bomb counting down to zero. Whitney stopped crying. She knelt beside her father, her eyes darting between the medic and the digital monitor, a fresh wave of panic settling over her features. She knew her father was lying, but she had desperately hoped the military personnel would be too intimidated by their wealth to call their bluff. Beatrice remained perfectly still on the floor, but her breathing had become noticeably shallow as she waited for the medical verdict that would either save them or destroy them completely. The blood pressure machine finished its cycle with a sharp electronic chirp. The cuff deflated rapidly. The combat medic leaned forward, inspecting the bright green digital numbers glowing on the screen. He then checked the steady rhythmic readout on the pulse oximeter. He did not look surprised. He did not look concerned. He looked profoundly irritated to be wasting his time on a civilian fraud. The medic unclipped the oximeter from Winston's finger and ripped the blood pressure cuff off his arm. He stood up slowly, towering over the supposedly dying patriarch. He turned his head and looked directly at Admiral Thorne, completely ignoring Winston and Whitney. Heart rate is 85. Blood pressure is 120/80. The medic announced, his voice booming across the grand ballroom with absolute, undeniable authority. He is perfectly fine, Commander. Just a theatrical performance. The silence that smashed into the room was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that instantly crushed the final breath out of the Wilson family's social empire. Winston froze completely. His fake gasping stopped in an instant. His hands, which had been tightly clutching his chest, slowly fell limply to his sides. He lay there in the ruined cake, staring up at the ceiling, his face burning with a level of humiliation so profound it was almost palpable. The lie was exposed. The performance was over. The ultimate manipulation had failed on the most spectacular stage imaginable. Whitney scrambled backward, crab walking away from her father as if he were suddenly radioactive. Her last line of defense, her final attempt to paint me as a villain, had been clinically and publicly dismantled by a United States military medic. Beatrice, realizing the fainting spell was no longer a viable escape strategy, slowly sat up from the floor. She did not look at me. She did not look at her husband. She stared blankly ahead, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their exposure. A low collective murmur began to ripple through the crowd of elite guests. The murmur quickly escalated into a wave of unfiltered vocal disgust. The people in this room were wealthy, ruthless, and opportunistic, but they despised weakness, and they absolutely loathed being made fools of. They had watched Winston steal from his own daughter. They had watched Beatrice fake a medical emergency. They had watched Donovan assault a federal officer. And now they had watched the patriarch of the family fake a heart attack to avoid accountability. It was pathetic, it was disgraceful, and it was highly contagious. A prominent venture capitalist, a man who had invested millions into Donovan's firm, threw his crystal champagne glass onto a nearby table in utter disgust. "This is an absolute circus," the investor spat, turning his back on the stage. "I am done with these frauds. Call the legal team. Sever every single contract immediately." His words were the catalyst. The dam broke. The remaining guests, the absolute elite of high society, turned their backs on the Wilson family in complete, synchronized unison. They did not whisper polite goodbyes. They did not offer hollow condolences. They simply began walking out of the grand ballroom en masse. The sound of hundreds of expensive leather shoes and designer heels marching toward the exits echoed like a funeral dirge for Winston's empire. They were fleeing the toxic blast radius, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the federal indictments and the spectacular public humiliation. I stood my ground, my posture unwavering, watching the mass exodus with cold satisfaction. The glittering chandeliers cast long shadows over the ruined stage, illuminating the pathetic remnants of my family. Winston remained flat on his back in the smashed cake. Beatrice sat frozen on the floor, staring into the void. Whitney knelt beside Donovan, who was still pinned under the crushing weight of the Navy SEALs. They were completely alone. The wealth, the status, the fake friends, the corporate allies, they were all gone. The grand ballroom, which had been filled with laughter and luxury just an hour ago, was now a silent, empty cavern of destruction. I looked down at the four of them, feeling the heavy federal badge resting in my pocket. The absolute power of truth had ripped through their illusions like a tactical strike, leaving nothing but the ugly, undeniable reality of who they truly were. The mass exodus escalated from a rapid departure into an outright humiliating stampede. The very people who had spent the last 2 hours drinking vintage champagne and toasting to Winston and Donovan's supposed brilliance were now frantically trampling over one another to escape the blast radius of a federal fraud investigation. It was a spectacular display of high society cannibalism. I watched as Arthur Pendleton, the CEO of the largest defense subcontracting firm on the Eastern Seaboard, violently shoved a towering $10,000 floral arrangement out of his way. The heavy crystal vase shattered against the polished marble floor, sending water and white roses everywhere, but Arthur did not even flinch. He already had his phone pressed tightly to his ear, screaming at his wealth manager to immediately liquidate every single share associated with Wilson Manufacturing. He demanded that all ties, all shadow accounts, and all pending contracts be severed before the market opened on Monday morning. Other executives immediately followed suit, their faces pale with the sudden realization of their own vulnerability. The grand ballroom echoed with the frantic overlapping sounds of dialing cell phones and panicked, breathless commands. Men in $10,000 tuxedos and women in custom couture gowns discarded their elegant facades entirely. They abandoned their expensive silk clutches, dropped their half-eaten plates of imported caviar, and focused solely on ruthless self-preservation. I heard the word indictment hissed through the crowd like a highly contagious virus. They knew exactly how the system worked. They knew that when the Department of Defense launched a targeted high-level audit with a direct military liaison, the fallout would be catastrophic and immediate. Anyone remotely connected to Donovan's offshore shell companies or Winston's illegal kickback schemes would be facing federal subpoenas and asset freezes by sunrise. Beatrice's closest friends, the women who had just been kissing her cheek and praising her flawless taste, literally ran past her without making eye contact, terrified of being associated with a family of exposed criminals. The sheer paralyzing terror of losing his fortune finally overrode Donovan's massive, fragile ego. The arrogant superiority that had defined his entire adult existence completely evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, groveling shell of a man. He managed to scramble out from under the grip of the Navy SEALs, who simply stepped back, crossed their arms, and allowed him to publicly humiliate himself. Donovan lunged forward, dragging himself across the champagne-soaked carpet toward Senator Hayes, a powerful politician who had regularly attended his lavish, exclusive dinner parties. Donovan gripped the hem of the senator's tailored trousers, his knuckles white, his face smeared with vanilla frosting and his own blood. "Senator, please," Donovan begged, his voice cracking with desperate, high-pitched hysteria. "You have to listen to me. You have to help me. This is all a massive, ridiculous misunderstanding. My corporate lawyers will clear this up in an hour. Just stay here. Do not pull your political backing. We have that massive merger next week. We are going to make millions of dollars. I can double your campaign contributions." Senator Hayes looked down at the bleeding, desperate billionaire with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He kicked his leg out violently, shaking off Donovan's grip as if he had just been touched by a diseased animal. "You are completely toxic, Donovan." The senator spat, his voice ringing with cold, calculating finality. "Do not ever contact my office again. Do not even say my name in public. I do not know you." The senator turned and marched out the double oak doors, tightly flanked by his private security detail. Winston was faring no better. "My father," The man who had always demanded absolute respect and commanded corporate boardrooms with a terrifying iron fist was literally dragging himself across the floorboards. He crawled over the shattered plates and crushed orchids chasing after Richard Vance, the primary venture capitalist who held the majority of the debt on the Wilson family estate. Richard, wait. Winston sobbed, his chest heaving as he reached out with trembling, desperate hands. I can fix this. I swear I can fix this. I can leverage the offshore accounts in the Caymans. I can sign the manufacturing company over to a proxy. Just give me 48 hours to move the capital. Do not call in the massive loans. Richard Vance did not even break his brisk stride. He motioned sharply for his bodyguards, who easily sidestepped the weeping patriarch. You are a dead man walking, Winston, Richard called over his shoulder, not bothering to look back at the pathetic display. I am freezing your corporate accounts the second I get to my car. You are entirely finished. I stood perfectly still amidst the absolute chaos, an immovable solid rock in a rapidly flowing river of panic and destruction. Guests rushed past the stage, giving me a wide, terrified berth, their eyes wide with fear and reluctant, fearful awe. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a single sudden movement. I did not try to stop anyone from leaving. I simply stood my ground and watched the systematic, brutal dismantling of a corrupt empire. The contrast was stark, brilliant, and undeniable. On the floor below me, the elite criminals of high society were thrashing, crying, and tearing each other apart for the useless scraps of their former glory. On the stage, the military personnel and I remained completely disciplined, anchored by the unyielding weight of the absolute truth. I let them destroy themselves. I let the toxic, rotting foundation of their relationships collapse under the sheer crushing pressure of legal accountability. Whitney was screaming hysterically at Beatrice, violently blaming her mother for encouraging the wedding and forcing her into a marriage with a bankrupt criminal. Beatrice was curled into a tight, trembling ball, weeping openly over her ruined social status and the absolute loss of her precious country club membership. They were a family built entirely on lies, manipulation, and stolen money, and without the stolen money to sustain those lies, they had absolutely nothing left but vicious, unfiltered resentment. Their polished masks had melted away, revealing the terrified, greedy monsters hiding underneath. Within 15 agonizing minutes, the grand ballroom was entirely deserted. The classical orchestra had fled out the service corridors, leaving their sheet music scattered on the floor. The catering staff had vanished, leaving trays of expensive food abandoned on the pristine white tables. The hundreds of wealthy investors, corrupt politicians, and elite socialites were completely gone. The only sounds left in the massive echoing space were the steady breathing of the Navy operatives and the pathetic, ragged sobs of my ruined family. Winston remained on the floor, surrounded by trampled orchids, spilled wine, and broken crystal glass. He slowly pushed himself up onto his shaking knees, his expensive custom suit ripped and ruined, his silver hair plastered to his sweating forehead. He looked around the empty, silent room, slowly processing the absolute totality of his destruction. His manufacturing company was gone. His sprawling estate was gone. His flawless reputation was incinerated. He was facing federal prison and absolute poverty. He had absolutely zero leverage left in his arsenal. He looked over at Donovan, who was bleeding and cursing on the floor, and realized the billionaire groom was just as useless and powerless as a broken piece of furniture. Winston slowly turned his head and looked up at me. He stared at the solid gold federal badge gleaming on the chest of my cheap gray dress, recognizing it as the ultimate symbol of the power he had just permanently lost. The frantic anger drained from his face, replaced rapidly by something far more insidious, desperate, and deeply disturbing. He stopped crying. He stopped his fake gasping. He pulled his trembling body up, attempting to smooth out his ruined lapels, and resorted to the most dangerous, toxic tactic he had left. Pure, pathetic emotional manipulation. He looked at me with wide, tear-filled, pleading eyes, forcing a trembling, affectionate, and deeply unnatural smile onto his lips. Sloane, my beautiful, brilliant daughter. Winston whispered, his voice dripping with manufactured warmth and desperate cloying longing. You have proven your point. You are so strong. You are so powerful and intelligent. I see that now with absolute clarity. I was wrong to ever doubt your potential. Everything I did, every harsh word I spoke, every strict rule I enforced, it was all just to push you to become this incredible, powerful woman standing before me today. I did it all for you. I was giving you tough love so you could conquer the world. And look at you now. You are a director. You are a leader. You are the only one who can save this family now. Please, Sloane, come back to me. Forgive your old man. Let me be your loving father again. We can run this empire together. Beatrice saw Winston shifting his tactics and instantly mirrored his desperate, groveling strategy. She abandoned all pretense of her theatrical fainting spell, sitting up abruptly and pushing herself up from the floorboards. Her expensive silk dress clung awkwardly to her trembling frame. Her perfectly coiffed hair was a tangled, static mess, and her thick mascara had run down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks, ruining her meticulously crafted high society facade. She crawled toward me on her hands and knees, stopping right beside her ruined husband. She reached out with shaking arms, her manicured fingers hovering just inches from my shoes. She was too terrified of the armed operatives to actually make physical contact, but she was entirely desperate to establish a maternal bond that had never genuinely existed. Sloane, my sweet, beautiful girl. Beatrice wept, her voice cracking with heavily forced manufactured emotion. You have to listen to your father. We always loved you. We always knew you were destined for greatness. You were just so stubborn, so wildly independent. We had to be hard on you to make you strong. We had to push you away so you would learn how to stand on your own 2 feet and reach your true potential. Look at the incredible, powerful woman you have become. I stared down at her, feeling a profound sense of revulsion settling in my chest. The sheer audacity of her lies, the casual way she attempted to rewrite a lifetime of neglect and theft into an act of maternal grace was utterly breathtaking. Please, Beatrice pleaded, clasping her hands against her chest in a gesture of frantic prayer. Do not throw away your family over a simple misunderstanding. We are your blood. We are the only people in this world who truly care about you. We can fix this mess. We can heal. Just put that federal pen away and tell the Admiral it was all a terrible mistake. We will give you anything you want. You can move back home. You can have the master's suite at the estate. You can have whatever luxury car you desire. Just come back to us. Winston nodded vigorously, wiping beads of sweat and smeared cake frosting from his forehead with a trembling hand. She is right, Sloane. I will call my lawyers right now. I will name you the primary beneficiary of the entire Wilson Trust. I will make you the chief executive officer of the manufacturing division. You will have absolute control over the board. Just tear up that cancellation order. We are your parents. You owe us a chance to make things right. Before I could even process the absolute staggering delusion of their bargaining, Donovan let out a wet, coughing laugh from the floorboards. He shifted his weight, wincing in agony as the Navy SEALs instantly adjusted their grip to keep him firmly immobilized against the oak stage. His face was bruising rapidly, his split lip leaking blood onto his white collar, but the greedy, calculating light in his eyes had not extinguished. He still believed he was sitting at the head of a corporate boardroom. He still believed that every single person on Earth had a price tag. You two are completely pathetic. Donovan sneered at my parents, his voice raspy and strained. You are offering her a bankrupt manufacturing firm and a totally empty trust fund. She is a federal director. She knows exactly how to read a balance sheet. She knows you have absolutely nothing left to give her. Donovan painfully craned his neck backward to look up at me. The operative, pressing a heavy tactical knee into his spine, applied an ounce of localized pressure, reminding Donovan of his compromised position, but the billionaire ignored the pain driven by pure survivalist greed. Listen to me, Sloane, Donovan hissed, his tone dropping into a slick, conspiratorial whisper. You are a highly intelligent woman. You played this game perfectly. You brought the military. You brought the federal audits. You cornered the market. But let us be entirely realistic about your situation. You are a government employee. You make a rigid, predetermined salary. You are going to spend the rest of your life reviewing paperwork in a gray, windowless cubicle for a fraction of what you are actually worth. He swallowed hard, his eyes gleaming with desperate bribery. I have offshore accounts in Zurich that the federal government does not even know exist. Donovan promised, his words rushing out in a frantic, hurried torrent. I have untraceable digital assets. I have massive shell companies in nations that do not comply with United States subpoenas. I can make you richer than you ever dreamed. I am talking $50 million untaxed and transferred directly to a secure account of your choosing by midnight. All you have to do is tell the Admiral that the Wilson manufacturing contracts require a secondary review. Tell him the initial audit was flawed. Give me 48 hours to restructure the paperwork. Whitney gasped from her position on the floor, staring at Donovan as if he had grown a second head. You are bribing her, Whitney shrieked, pointing an accusatory finger at his bloody face. You are trying to pay her off with our money while I am sitting right here. Shut up, Whitney, Donovan barked, never taking his desperate eyes off me. This is business. Sloan knows exactly how the game is played. $50 million, Sloan. You can walk away from this miserable, toxic family and live like an absolute queen for the rest of your natural life. Every single person has a price. What is yours? The silence that followed his massive financial offer was absolute. The two Navy operatives flanking him did not react, their expressions carved from hardened stone. Admiral Thorne stood near the edge of the stage, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the pathetic display of corporate bribery with quiet military disgust. I looked at Winston, who was staring at me with a desperate, hopeful glimmer in his eye, clearly praying that I would take Donovan's dirty money and somehow save their corrupt ecosystem in the process. I looked at Beatrice, who was holding her breath, waiting for me to succumb to the underlying greed she believed was inherent in all of us. I looked at Donovan, who was smiling a bloody, arrogant smile, entirely convinced that his vast wealth was an ultimate shield against federal consequence. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out my heavy federal credentials, tracing the gold seal of the Department of Defense with my thumb. You did not make me strong, I said, my voice echoing through the vast, empty ballroom, like a judge reading a final sentence. My tone was entirely devoid of anger. It was stripped of all residual childhood resentment. It was nothing but pure, freezing fact. I looked directly into Beatrice's weeping, heavily lined eyes. You tried to break me. You systematically stripped away every resource, every comfort, and every shred of support I ever had. You stole my future to fund your superficial vanity and pay for Whitney's plastic surgery. I did not succeed because of your tough love. I survived despite you. I thrived because I removed myself from your toxic, parasitic influence. I shifted my gaze to Winston, watching the very last flicker of hope die in his chest. Family is not a corporate bargaining chip, I told him coldly. Blood does not excuse massive federal fraud. You made your choices when you decided to put defective, shattering ballistic plates on the chests of active-duty American soldiers. You chose your luxury cars over their lives. Do not dare ask me for mercy when you showed absolutely none to the men and women relying on your gear in hostile combat zones. Finally, I looked down at Donovan. His bloody smile faltered instantly. The arrogant light in his eyes began to dim as he realized his ultimate weapon. His limitless bank account was completely useless against me. And as for your offshore accounts, Donovan, I continued, my voice sharp and unyielding, my integrity is not for sale. I do not want your dirty money. I do not want a seat at your corrupt table. I want to see you stripped of every single asset you have stolen from the taxpayers of this country. I want to see you held accountable for every fraudulent signature on those Department of Defense contracts. Donovan's face went completely slack. The terrifying reality of his impending, unavoidable imprisonment finally settled over his features like a heavy lead blanket. He dropped his head back against the polished oak floorboards, closing his eyes in absolute crushing defeat. But Winston was not ready to surrender. He pushed himself up onto his knees again, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple with a renewed surge of desperate, flailing panic. You cannot do this! Winston screamed, his voice breaking into a harsh sob. You are taking everything: the company, the offshore accounts, the investments. We will have absolutely nothing left. We will have to sell the estate, the Wilson family home. It has been in my name for 30 years. You are rendering your own parents completely homeless. I watched his pathetic, dramatic display for a long moment, letting him sit in the absolute terror of his impending poverty. Then I unclasped the brass latches of my heavy leather briefcase one final time. I reached into the very back compartment and pulled out a single neatly folded piece of federal stationery. I held the document by the corner, letting the thick watermarked paper catch the light of the remaining crystal chandeliers overhead. You are not going to sell the Wilson estate, Winston, I announced, watching his eyes widen with a sudden sharp spike of fresh terror. I stepped forward and dropped the document directly onto the ruined frosting-covered table right next to his trembling hands. It was a formal, heavily stamped notice from the United States Department of Justice. Because you cannot sell a property you no longer legally own, I stated calmly. Winston stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. Beatrice let out a short, terrified gasp, crawling closer to read the bold, black text printed across the top of the page. When you secured those massive commercial loans to cover the initial kickbacks for Donovan's defense contracts, you did not just use the manufacturing firm as collateral. I explained, my voice echoing over their stunned, breathless silence. You leveraged the entire generational estate. You tied the deed of the mansion directly to the fraudulent federal payouts. And because those payouts were obtained through a highly coordinated illegal kickback scheme involving defective military equipment, the Department of Justice has triggered an immediate asset forfeiture protocol under the federal racketeering statutes. The air in the room seemed to vanish entirely. Winston's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. His entire physical world had just been erased with a single federal signature. As of 0900 hours this morning, the Wilson estate is official property of the United States federal government. I declared, delivering the final fatal blow to his carefully constructed empire. Federal agents are currently at the main gates of your beloved generational mansion right now, Winston. They are changing the locks. They are changing the exterior gate locks and securing the perimeter right this second. The federal agents are seizing every physical asset, every corporate vehicle, and every piece of fine art you purchased with dirty money. Winston let out a strangled, high-pitched wheeze. His face drained of whatever color it had left, turning a sickly, translucent shade of gray. He grabbed the edge of the frosting-covered table, pulling himself up so violently that the entire table shuddered, sending a silver champagne bucket crashing to the floor. "That is completely impossible," Winston stammered, his eyes wide and unblinking. His voice was a frantic, breathless whisper. "You are lying. You have to be lying." The secondary mortgage was entirely shielded. I used a blind trust registered in Delaware to authorize the equity transfer. The bank guaranteed me absolute discretion. They swore the leveraging of the estate would never appear on the primary corporate ledgers. It was a closed-door agreement. I smiled. It was a sharp, razor-thin expression that held absolutely zero warmth. You are operating under the delusion that federal investigators care about a bank's promise of discretion, I replied, my voice echoing through the vast, empty space. You took out a massive secret mortgage on a historical property to illegally fund Donovan's fraudulent military venture. You thought you were a financial genius. You thought you could bypass your own board of directors by putting the roof over your head on the line. But when the Department of Defense flagged Donovan's shell companies, they followed the money directly back to the source. They found the blind trust in under an hour. Winston stumbled backward, his knees giving out entirely. He collapsed into a designated seating chair, staring at his trembling hands. The sheer crushing reality of his arrogance was finally breaking through his impenetrable ego. He had risked everything he owned on a man who was currently bleeding on the floorboards, surrounded by armed operatives. The bank is now operating under federal receivership due to their complicity in your fraud. I continued, pacing slowly across the ruined stage. They are freezing the electronic security system at the estate as we speak. Since the defense contracts are officially void, the bank will trigger the absolute default clause by Monday morning. You have exactly 72 hours to pack your personal bags. The silence in the grand ballroom became a physical, suffocating entity. 72 hours. Winston repeated, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. You have 72 hours to collect your clothing and whatever basic necessities you can carry, I clarified, staring down at him with unyielding authority. You cannot take the antique furniture. You cannot take the luxury vehicles parked in the garage. You cannot take the jewelry purchased after the loan was finalized. Every single item of value in that house now belongs to the United States government. On Monday morning, federal marshals will arrive to physically escort you off the premises. The last of the straggling catering staff and terrified venue managers were currently sprinting through the service doors, desperate to escape the wreckage of the Wilson family. I stood amidst the fleeing crowd like a rock in a river, completely untouched and entirely unbothered. The chaos swirled around me, but it could not reach me. I was immune to their panic. I was immune to their manufactured tears. I had spent my entire life being punished for their vanity, and now I was the architect of their ultimate accountability. A sudden piercing wail shattered the quiet of the room. Beatrice threw her head back and unleashed a scream of pure, unadulterated agony. It was not a cry of sorrow for her fractured family. It was not a plea for forgiveness for her decades of maternal neglect. It was the agonizing soul-tearing shriek of a narcissist realizing her entire identity was being incinerated in real time. My house, Beatrice sobbed, tearing at the expensive silk of her ruined designer gown. My beautiful house. The winter gala is supposed to be hosted in my ballroom next month. The Historical Society is coming for the garden tour. You cannot take my home. You cannot do this to me. I am Beatrice Wilson. I sit on the board of the country club. I am the chairwoman of the charity committee. She crawled across the carpet. Her makeup completely destroyed, her fake eyelashes hanging off her face like dying spiders. She grabbed Winston by his torn lapels and began shaking him violently. Fix it! Winston! Beatrice screamed, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Call the bank president, call the governor, call someone and fix this right now. Tell them it was a mistake. I will not be poor. I will not pack my things into cardboard boxes like some common laborer. My friends will see. The entire country club will watch us be evicted. I will be a laughingstock. I will lose my membership. I will lose everything. Winston could not even look at her. He just stared at the floor. Tears leaking from his eyes, a broken, empty shell of the tyrant who had once ruled our family with an iron fist. He had no phone calls left to make. The politicians had fled. The venture capitalists had abandoned him. He was a radioactive pariah, and his wife was finally seeing him for the pathetic fraud he truly was. Beatrice released his lapels and collapsed onto her side, sobbing uncontrollably into the champagne-soaked carpet. In a single afternoon, her entire universe had been violently eradicated. She was losing her generational mansion. She was losing her elite social status. And she was losing her golden child's wealthy future. She looked over at Donovan, the billionaire savior she had aggressively groomed Whitney to marry, and saw nothing but a bruised, bankrupt criminal facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The fairy tale was dead. The money was gone. She was going to be the very thing she had spent her entire life mocking and despising. She was going to be poor. Whitney had remained completely silent for the last several minutes. She was still kneeling on the floor next to Donovan, her hands stained with the vanilla frosting from the ruined wedding cake. She looked at her fiancé. He was groveling, bleeding, and entirely stripped of his power. He could no longer provide her with private jets, designer wardrobes, or luxurious vacations in the south of France. He was worse than useless to her now. He was an anchor tied to her neck, dragging her down into the abyss of federal investigations and public disgrace. Without a single word of comfort, Whitney slowly stood up. She did not offer Donovan a hand. She did not ask the medics to check his injuries. She simply stepped over him as if he were a discarded piece of trash on the sidewalk. Her survival instincts were entirely parasitic, and her current host was dead. She needed to find a new source of resources immediately, or she would be swept out into the streets alongside her ruined parents. Whitney turned slowly and looked up at me. She stared at my tailored gray dress. She stared at the federal badge clipped to my belt. She stared at the armed Navy operatives flanking me, recognizing the sheer, undeniable power and stability that I now possessed. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the sister she could mock for living in a small apartment and working a government job. I was the only person in the room who still had a salary, a home, and a future. Whitney took a hesitant step forward, her ruined wedding gown dragging heavily across the debris. She wiped her eyes, instantly summoning a fresh batch of thick, trembling tears. She adjusted her posture, shrinking her shoulders to make herself look small, vulnerable, and completely innocent. She was trying to deploy the exact same manipulative tactics she had used since we were children. The same tactics that always resulted in our parents giving her whatever she demanded. Sloane Whitney whispered, her voice quivering with perfectly calibrated fragile desperation. Sloane, please. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. The emotional manipulation simply bounced off my armor. I watched her trying to calculate a way out of the devastation, watching the gears turn in her incredibly selfish mind. You heard what you just said? Whitney cried softly, clasping her hands together in front of her chest. They are taking the house. They are taking everything. Mom and Dad are going to have to figure out their own mess, but I did not do anything wrong. I am just a victim in all of this. Donovan lied to me. He used me. I have absolutely nowhere to go. I do not have a job. I do not have any money in my personal accounts. She took another step closer, gazing up at me with wide, pleading eyes. She was fully expecting me to fold. She was expecting the ingrained familial guilt to take over. She actually believed that after decades of relentless psychological torture and public humiliation, I would simply open my doors to her because we shared the same last name. You have to help me, Sloane. Whitney begged, reaching out a trembling hand toward me. I cannot sleep on the street. I cannot be homeless. I am your little sister. I stared down at her, letting the heavy, suffocating silence of the ruined ballroom stretch between us. Whitney was still kneeling in the spilled champagne and crushed cake, frosting her designer wedding gown soaked and ruined. She looked up at me with those wide, perfectly manufactured, tearful eyes. It was the exact same expression she had used since we were toddlers, the same calculated look of vulnerability that had always guaranteed our parents would rush to her defense and give her whatever she wanted. But our parents were currently paralyzed by their own impending federal indictments. They could not save her. She was entirely reliant on the sister she had spent her entire life mocking and degrading. When I did not immediately reach out to comfort her, a sudden ugly shift occurred in Whitney's demeanor. The fragile, trembling victim act evaporated in a matter of seconds. The realization that I was not going to play the role of the forgiving, accommodating savior ignited a fierce, entitled rage inside her. She pushed herself up from the floor, her hands balling into fists at her sides, her face contorting into a mask of spoiled fury. You are not saying anything, Whitney hissed, her voice rising in pitch, bouncing sharply off the vaulted ceilings. Why are you just standing there staring at me? You have to fix this. You created this entire nightmare. You waited until my wedding day to do this. You deliberately chose today to maximize the damage and humiliate me in front of hundreds of people. You ruined my future, Sloane. Donovan was going to take care of me. I was going to be a billionaire's wife. Now I have absolutely nothing, and it is entirely your fault. She took another step toward me, jabbing a manicured finger in my direction. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her entitlement was staggering. She was standing in the epicenter of a massive federal fraud takedown, surrounded by armed military operatives, and her only concern was her own luxury lifestyle. You owe me, Whitney demanded, her voice shrill and commanding, echoing the exact tone our mother used when berating service workers. You have a high-paying federal salary. You have grandmother's $200,000 trust fund that you are probably hoarding. You owe me restitution for destroying my marriage. The government is going to seize my Porsche, so you need to buy me a new luxury vehicle. I need a place to live by tomorrow morning. I want a penthouse apartment in the city, and I want the rent paid in full for the next 2 years. I need a living stipend until I can figure out my next move because my credit cards are going to be frozen by the authorities. You took Donovan away from me, so you are going to take his place and provide for me. I will not live like a peasant because of your psychotic vendetta. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not display a single ounce of the anger she was so desperately trying to provoke. I leaned in close to her, bringing my face just inches from hers. The sudden proximity made her instinctively step back, but she was trapped against the edge of the ruined stage. I looked directly into her eyes, stripping away every ounce of familial obligation I had ever been conditioned to feel. I do not owe you anything, I stated, my voice dropping to a lethal, freezing whisper. Every single word was sharp and precise, cutting through her delusions like a scalpel. You stood by and cheered while our parents treated me like a disposable burden. You laughed when they sold my childhood belongings. You proudly wore designer clothes and drove a vintage sports car funded entirely by money stolen from my inheritance and embezzled from military defense contracts. You knew exactly who Donovan was. You knew he was a corrupt, arrogant criminal, but you did not care as long as he kept your bank accounts full and your social status elevated. Whitney opened her mouth to protest, to launch another volley of fabricated victimhood, but I cut her off instantly, refusing to give her an inch of breathing room. You built your entire identity on being the golden child. I continued my gaze, pinning her in place. You thought you were untouchable because Mom and Dad shielded you from every single consequence. You mocked me for joining the military. You called me a grunt and a failure while you lived a life of luxury funded by fraud. But this is the real world, Whitney. The real world does not care about your country club membership or your ruined wedding gown. The real world demands accountability. You made your bed with stolen money. Now lie in it. Whitney gasped, stumbling backward as if I had physically struck her. The absolute unyielding finality in my voice shattered her last remaining illusion. She was not getting a penthouse apartment. She was not getting a monthly stipend. She was completely, utterly on her own, armed with absolutely zero marketable skills and a reputation that was currently burning to the ground alongside her parents' empire. I turned my back on her. I completely dismissed her existence, pivoting away from the weeping, frantic remnants of my family to face Admiral Thorne. The massive, decorated naval commander was standing with his arms crossed, watching the entire exchange with a look of profound, quiet respect. He had seen countless tactical operations, but he recognized the specific, agonizing difficulty of neutralizing a toxic family unit. I am done here, sir, I said, looking up at the Admiral. My voice was steady, calm, and entirely professional. The personal mission was complete. The federal operation was now fully in his hands. Admiral Thorne nodded slowly. He uncrossed his arms and gave me a single crisp salute. It was a gesture of absolute validation, a confirmation that I belonged to a brotherhood of honor and discipline that my biological family could never comprehend. Excellent work. Director Admiral Thorne replied, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute authority. The Department of Defense appreciates your exceptional service. The scale of this fraud is unprecedented, and your intelligence gathering was flawless. We will handle the garbage disposal from here. Thorne raised his hand and gestured to the Navy SEALs securing the perimeter. Instantly, the operatives moved with terrifying synchronized precision. Two massive combat specialists hauled Donovan up from the floorboards by his armpits. The billionaire let out a pathetic groan of pain as they dragged his ruined, bloody body toward the grand exit. Another team of agents began confiscating laptops and cell phones from the event coordinators, securing all digital evidence of the lavish event funded by stolen government capital. Donovan did not fight back. He did not issue any more threats. He was entirely broken, his spirit crushed by the undeniable reality of federal custody. I stepped off the stage, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I did not look back at Beatrice, who was still rocking back and forth in the spilled champagne, sobbing loudly over the loss of her precious social empire and her impending eviction. I did not look back at Whitney, who had collapsed against a shattered floral arrangement, weeping hysterically as she realized she was going to have to find a real job to survive. I had spent 34 years carrying the suffocating weight of their expectations, their cruelty, and their endless demands. I was finally putting that weight down. I walked down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, heading directly toward the massive arched oak doors. The cool night air drifted in from the lobby, smelling of rain and absolute freedom. I felt lighter than I had ever felt in my entire life. The suffocating chains of the Wilson family legacy were permanently severed. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the forgotten daughter. I was a decorated federal agent who had just dismantled a criminal enterprise, and I was walking out of their lives forever. Sloan. The scream tore through the ballroom, echoing violently off the crystal chandeliers. It was not a plea. It was not a command. It was a primal, gut-wrenching roar of absolute defeat. Winston had managed to drag himself upright, standing unsteadily on legs that could barely support his weight. His face was a mottled, dangerous shade of purple, and his breathing was ragged and shallow. He was clutching the edge of a table, staring at my retreating back with a look of pure, unchecked terror. He was watching his scapegoat, his punching bag, and his final remaining asset walk out the door forever. He was a tyrant who had just lost his entire kingdom, his freedom, and his legacy, and he was screaming into the void, completely powerless to stop the total annihilation of his life. I did not stop walking. I did not turn around. I pushed through the heavy oak doors, stepping out into the cool, dark night, and left them all behind to burn in the ashes of their own making. Waiting for me in the courtyard was a staggering display of federal and military might. The entire perimeter had been secured. I walked out of the country club flanked by the 300 SEALs and armed operatives who had locked down the estate. They formed a solid, impenetrable corridor of heavily armed personnel. As Admiral Thorne fell into step beside me, the operatives simultaneously fell in line. The sheer, overwhelming sound of their synchronized footsteps striking the wet pavement was deafening. It was a rhythmic, thunderous march of absolute authority. The heavy measured boots completely drowned out the crying and screaming of my biological family inside the venue. The frantic cries of a ruined dynasty were swallowed entirely by the march of justice. The fallout over the next several months was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. Federal prosecutors did not offer plea deals to arrogant men who deliberately put defective ballistic armor on active-duty soldiers. Winston and Donovan were indicted on 74 counts of federal racketeering, wire fraud, conspiracy, and treason. They both faced federal charges that would ensure they never saw the outside of a maximum security penitentiary for the rest of their natural lives. Donovan's limitless offshore accounts were traced, frozen, seized, and completely repatriated to the Department of Defense. Winston's massive ego shattered as he spent his days in a sterile concrete cell, entirely forgotten by the corporate world he once ruled. Beatrice's descent into poverty was a spectacular, highly publicized tragedy. The Department of Justice seized the generational estate just as I had promised, auctioning off her priceless antiques. She ended up living in a tiny rented apartment on the industrial side of the city, positioned directly above a noisy commercial laundromat. She had no domestic staff, no designer wardrobe, and absolutely no social standing. She spent her days staring at peeling wallpaper, completely shunned by her wealthy friends and the elite society that had once worshipped her. Poverty was a highly contagious disease in her circles, and Beatrice was permanently infected. Whitney's grand billion-dollar fairy tale shattered instantly. The moment Donovan was indicted and his assets were seized by the federal government, her marriage was annulled before the ink dried on the certificate. Stripped of her trust fund, her wealthy fiancé, and her parents' financial backing, Whitney was forced to face the real world with absolutely zero survival skills. The former golden child was forced to work double shifts as a front desk receptionist at a budget car rental agency, spending her meager paychecks on rent for a windowless basement studio. There were no more private jets or luxury shopping sprees. There was only the harsh, grinding reality of the working-class life she had spent her entire childhood mocking. I let the final updates of their miserable, fractured lives wash over me like a passing breeze, feeling absolutely no guilt and no triumph. It was simply the natural, unavoidable consequence of their own unchecked greed. I closed the thick operational dossier on my desk and permanently deleted their files from my secure server. The Wilson family was a closed case. I stepped out of the command tent and walked onto the sprawling, windswept tarmac of the Naval Air Station. The early morning sun was just beginning to break over the distant horizon, casting a brilliant, fiery glow across the massive gray fuselage of the C-17 Globemaster waiting on the runway. The heavy jet engines were already whining with a low, powerful hum, preparing for a classified transport sequence. The smell of jet fuel and sea salt filled the air, a scent that always signaled the beginning of a new mission. Standing on the tarmac next to the military transport plane, I raised my hand to my chest. My fingers brushed against the cool, heavy metal of the Navy Cross, pinned perfectly to my tactical uniform. It was the highest decoration a civilian director could receive, awarded by the Department of Defense for exceptional valor and flawless intelligence execution. But the prestigious medal itself was not what truly mattered to me. What mattered was the group of men and women standing at the base of the aircraft loading ramp. I was surrounded by my squad, my team, my actual family. They were fully geared up, laughing and checking their equipment with the easy, unbreakable camaraderie forged in high-stakes combat zones and endless, grueling operations. There was Jackson securing the final heavy cargo crates with a grin. There was Miller double-checking the tactical communication arrays and giving me a thumbs up. And there was Admiral Thorne holding a fresh cup of black coffee waiting for my final authorization to board. These were people who did not care about the balance of my bank account, the designer labels in my closet, or the prestige of my bloodline. These were people who had bled for me, fought for me, and respected me purely for the content of my character and the sharpness of my mind. I walked toward them, the strong coastal wind catching my hair, a genuine, unburdened smile finally breaking across my face. I looked back at the distant city skyline one last time, thinking of the grand ballroom, the ruined wedding, and the people who had tried so desperately to keep me small, insignificant, and isolated. Family isn't blood. Family is who stands by you in the trenches. They tried to bury me at table 42, but they forgot. I learned how to thrive in the dark. The most powerful lesson from Sloane's journey is that biological ties do not excuse toxic behavior, and true family is defined by mutual respect, not just blood. For years, her relatives used familial obligation to manipulate and diminish her. However, Sloane's ultimate triumph wasn't merely exposing their crimes. It was her steadfast refusal to succumb to their final guilt trips. She taught us that walking away from an abusive environment is a courageous, necessary step towards self-preservation. Protect your peace and boldly surround yourself with a chosen family that genuinely values you. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with toxic relatives? Share your story and comment below.